The Dauntless, Star Legend Book 5, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Part 2, Chapter 1. Wright stared down at his breakfast. The bagel sat untouched on his plate, and his mug of black coffee was full to the brim. He had no appetite. Just the thought of putting the food or drink to his lips made him want to vomit. For some reason he didn't quite understand. He felt like it was his 18th birthday again. He was walking up the garden path of his home, back from school. It had been a good day. His friends had bought him presents and played a few harmless pranks on the birthday boy. He'd enjoyed the attention and sense of comradeship from the people he'd known since he was 11 or younger. He'd been on a high, full of the excitement of coming of age, of becoming an adult in the eyes of society. During school hours, he managed to forget the coldness at home. He wasn't sure how old he'd been when he'd realised his parents didn't want him, let alone love him, but he'd known it most of his childhood. Unlike his friends' parents, they were never happy to see him or interested in what he did. He was always fed and clothed, and they never hit him or shouted at him, but neither was there ever any warmth or affection from them. His presence was tolerated, and that was it. So when he got home from school that day, he really should have expected the pile of belongings sitting outside his parents' front door. They hadn't given him any warning, but the writing had been on the wall for years. He should have seen it coming. They no longer had any legal responsibility for his welfare. The severing of their relationship was effective immediately. It took him a couple of minutes to get over the shock. After that, he didn't even bother ringing the doorbell. He'd never been allowed a key. Instead, he called his best friend and explained the situation, embarrassed and hurt. His friend's parents had put him up for the remainder of the school year. Tactful and kind, they had never brought up the subject of his mother and father's behaviour. And he had never mentioned it, not to them or anyone else, not once in the years that had passed. He always told people his parents were dead. To him, they were. His friend's parents had helped him with the legal side of things, so he wouldn't have to rely on his parents' financial support for further study. But in the end, he'd applied for Royal Marines officer training. He hadn't wanted to impose on the kindness of strangers any longer, and he figured that if his real family didn't want him, he would find another one in his work. As the saying goes, the rest was history. Ancient history. So why was that gut-wrenching, frantic feeling back again? The sound of chair legs scraping on tile drew him back to the present. He looked up. Arthur was sitting down opposite him. "Did you see Talon last night?" Wright nodded. "Did you try to persuade her to come on the mission?" "No. Why would I do that? I believe her presence may be vital." Wright stared at him. "She has 2 kids to look after. You seriously believe she would even consider setting off into interstellar space? I don't understand why she was even asked to come here. What kind of parent would abandon their children?" He breathed in sharply. Was that where the feeling was coming from? When he was a kid, his parents would have abandoned him in a heartbeat, given the chance. "As I said at the meeting," Arthur countered, "perhaps her children could come too." "No, it doesn't work like that." Wright imagined the disparaging comments from BA military higher-ups about creches and nursemaids. Even if Talon were to consider the idea, which I'm sure she wouldn't, the Dauntless is a military vessel embarking on a military mission. It's far too dangerous a place for children. Taking them with us would be entirely against protocol. He sighed and rested his forehead on his fingertips. Is something wrong, TJ? I'm not feeling great, that's all. He could feel Arthur watching him. They sat in silence, the bustle and hum of the mess going on around them. You will miss Talon when we leave, said Arthur softly. Wright didn't answer. He was barely keeping it together as it was. Are you considering not coming on the mission too? Arthur asked. No, I must. The future of humanity is under threat, and the Alliance is right to attempt to do something about it. I must play my part. He almost added, This is what I do. It's who I am. But he wasn't sure that was true anymore. Another silence stretched out. Wright's bagel and cooling coffee occupied his vision. Arthur's chair scraped the floor again as he stood up, and then the man's large hand clamped down on his shoulder. You must do what you feel is right, TJ. That's all any of us can do. It was as if the king had heard what he was thinking. A shadow passed over Wright as he walked away. A second later, Major! Colburn had arrived and was staring down at him pensively. Carla Orr is being difficult again. We're concerned that if she returns to the surface she might do something stupid, so she'll remain here until we're ready to leave. Wright tensed as he predicted what was coming next. You're in charge of keeping her under control until we're underway. He inwardly groaned. Yes, Brigadier. Her stare hardened. Don't mope, man. It doesn't suit you. She left. He had a lot of respect for Colburn, but sometimes he ached to punch her in the face. Chapter 2. Carla Orr crouched in the shadows near the airlock. Her posture was so undignified she felt sickened. How had things come to this, that she, Dwyer Orr, was forced to hide like a common fugitive? It was as if she had done something wrong, not the vile people who now felt as though they had the right to control her life. She should never have agreed to come here. She hated this ship and everything it stood for. The Dauntless? Her! The Britannic Alliance was not dauntless, and its mission to explore interstellar space in the hope of discovering more about aliens like Merlin and Morgan was arrogant and foolish. The Alliance had only succeeded in winning back the BI through a set of odd coincidences. The pattern Arthur spoke of was nonsense. Entities like Morgan exercised control, and if they had been playing with human lives, so what? Hopefully they would not return for a very long time, long after she and Perrin were dead. She had a kingdom to rule, and the Alliance was determined to keep her from it. That was the real reason for this mission. They wanted to separate her from Perrin. With her out of the way, they could do as they pleased with the remaining EAC lands. Perrin was too young and weak to defy them. By the time she returned, it would all be over. She couldn't let that happen. She had to return to Earth. With Arthur gone, it shouldn't be too hard to push back all the Alliance initiatives and fight for her people and their way of life. Footsteps echoed down the passageway. The party about to disembark was arriving. She peeked out. 2 guards appeared around a bend in the corridor. If the main group was sufficiently far away, she watched from the shadows as the first guard opened the airlock. The 2 stepped inside. A clunk resounded as the farther hatch was opened. Now was her chance. She threw a glance up the passageway. It was empty, though the footsteps and voices were growing louder. She ran into the airlock. Her foot caught on the lip of the hatch, and she came down heavily on her knee and right wrist, the impact jarring up to her shoulder. In another second, she was up and running into the shuttle. One of the soldiers was suddenly in her way. They collided and she bounced backward, almost falling again. "Sorry, ma'am," the man said, confused. "I didn't see you." He didn't know she wasn't supposed to be here. "Be more careful next time," she snapped, before stepping around him and into the passenger cabin. Where to hide? Ugh! She hated stooping to this ridiculous behaviour. But if she could only make it to Earth once she was out in public in the spaceport, the Alliance wouldn't dare drag her away against her will. Tensions were high and the BA couldn't risk inciting insurrection. The shuttle would be full. More dignitaries had been visiting the Dauntless than had been present at the meeting. There was no point in trying to sneak under some seats or into one of the larger lockers. She would soon be discovered. The noise of approaching people burst from behind her. They'd reached the airlock. She dashed down the aisle. There was nothing for it. She would have to hide in the restroom. Her stomach churning with loathing, she slipped into the small room and locked the door. "Yes, she's a beautiful ship," said a booming male voice. "I'm sad to leave her. Wish I was going on the mission myself. But sadly my days of active service are over." It was the Sea Lord, Fox. The odious man was a dreadful bore. He had to be subjecting a lesser official to his self-important monologue. "Of course, as soon as we heard about the presence of aliens on Earth for centuries interfering in human affairs, my mind immediately sprang to the Dauntless. She was always intended for stealth operations. The cloaking equipment we trialled on the Gallant was a part of her original design. What's that?" Someone else spoke, but too quietly for Carla to make out what they said. Yes, all right," said Fox impatiently. It was probably someone telling him to fasten his seatbelt, because as he replied, a vibration had started up beneath Carla's feet. The shuttle engine had ignited. Everyone was aboard, and the hatch must have been shut. She was nearly on her way. "And the very latest in armaments, naturally," Fox went on. "Though I can't tell you anything about that, of course. The war might be over, and the Dauntless might be leaving the solar system for a while, but we can't be too careful. You never know when the Alliance might be called upon to save the day once more." Carla's fingernails dug into her palms as she tightened her hands into fists. Save the day? The man's smugness was beyond words. The BA hadn't saved the day. It had torn her from her people and intended to make her son a puppet, depriving millions of the right to live their lives as they chose. Fox droned on. What was taking so long? The shuttle should have left by now. Fox abruptly stopped speaking. At the same time, other voices in the passenger cabin grew quieter. They'd been chattering, but a hush descended. What was going on? Rap, rap, rap. The loud knocking at the restroom door made her jump. She was still. "Open up," a male voice ordered. It sounded familiar. Was it? The lock disengaged and the door opened. Major Wright stood in the doorway with a face like thunder. "Come with me." There was no dweer, no ma'am, no deference at all. The man had no idea of the respect she deserved. She would never forget how he had held her down and threatened her after she had tried to kill his stupid cat. "I will not." He strode in, twisted her arm up her back and forced her out into the cabin. "Let go of me," she yelled. "You have no right to lay hands on me. Ow! You're hurting me. You're assaulting the dweer. I won't stand for it. I'll—" All the passengers watched as the Major frog-marched her down the aisle. The humiliation was too much to bear. Then she saw Taylan Ellis and her horrible children. How come she, a nobody, was allowed to refuse to join the stupid mission while the Dwyer was not? The Major slowed down briefly as he passed Ellis, but then pushed harder, making her walk faster until they were through the airlock and back aboard the Dauntless. As she was urged down the passageway, the airlock hatch clanked closed behind them. Only then did the Major's pressure on her arm ease. He released her, and she spun to face him before slapping him hard across the cheek. "How dare you manhandle me? Never touch me again, or I'll—" He drove his forearm into her throat, thrusting her against the wall and knocking the back of her head into it. Outraged, she was about to scream at him, but his arm pressed into her windpipe so hard she couldn't speak. "Listen to me," he hissed, his eyes full of hatred and rage. "We'll be aboard this ship a long time, and I'm the poor bastard in charge of you while you're here. Put one more step out of line, make one more attempt to leave, and I'll space you. No question. I don't care what Arthur says. The Alliance doesn't need you. The BI doesn't need you. No one will care if you return from this mission. Do you understand me?" She wanted to defy him. She wanted to threaten him. But from the look on his face, she was in no doubt he meant every word he'd said. She had no choice except to nod in reply. He stepped back and his arm dropped to his side. She rubbed her throat, expecting him to tell her to return to her cabin or give another order, but he walked off as if she no longer existed. She watched him leave. "Do you really think you can tell me what to do, Major Wright? I might have lost my son and my kingdom, but I still have some fight left in me. I have nothing left to lose now. You had better watch your back." Chapter 3. A hollow of the local galactic sector hung in the air in the briefing room. The lights had been dimmed to near darkness in order to make the star systems clearly visible. Wright stared, unseeing, at the display. Lieutenant General Carroll had been droning on for half an hour about the mission, going over facts everyone knew already. The man loved the sound of his own voice. Spending the next who knew how many months in his company promised to be challenging. Wright recalled the crew of the Resolute. What a contrast! If only Ford, Jeong and the others were here, it might make the trip more bearable. Even Kroll would be a pleasure to have aboard compared to Carroll, Colburn and, worst of all, Carla Orr. Just the sight of the woman made his blood boil. "So, as you know," Carroll said, "we aren't heading for the obvious target, Alpha Centauri. Probe data indicates no atmosphere on any of the planets of Proxima Centauri or the binary system, so it's a waste of time." Iolani Hale gave a loud cough. "Instead," Carroll continued, "Pardon me," said Hale, "I'd like to say something." The Lieutenant General's face twisted in annoyance, as if he was not used to being interrupted. He laid down the pointer he'd been using to indicate the stars he mentioned. "Please be my guest, Ms. Hale." A trace of sarcasm had crept into his tone, but the scientist either didn't notice or didn't care. She rose to her feet. "I'd like my objection to the choice of destination for this mission to go on the record. I expressed my concerns and reasoning when the decision was made, but my opinion was disregarded." Carroll said, "The Alliance must take all opinions into account when deciding where to allocate its resources and funding. I'm sure your expertise and experience is valued and appreciated. Nevertheless, there's no reason to suppose these aliens aren't living on an Alpha Centauran planet," Hale interrupted. "We have anecdotal evidence that they're able to survive in the vacuum of space. they don't need a breathable atmosphere. And if they're able to change their physical state from a solid to a gas at will, they probably aren't bound by gravity either. They could easily exist on a high-G planet, or even a moon or asteroid. In which case, said Carol, they could be anywhere. So by your own logic, it really doesn't matter where we go. Wright wasn't entirely up to speed on their destination. All he knew was the planet was the nearest that could sustain life, but not human life, according to the data from Talman's probes. He didn't know Carol particularly well, but he knew him well enough to be confident the officer didn't have the first idea of what he was talking about. He knew nothing about exoplanets or extraterrestrial organisms. He'd been given the destination, and that was where he was going, come hell or high water. Hale was wasting her time. She just didn't know it yet. Wright asked, "Can you tell us any more about what you've figured out about the aliens?" Carol shot him an angry look. Wright was siding with the civilian and against his superior officer, but he didn't care. Looking somewhat mollified, Hale replied, "Well, it's all supposition until I get the chance to study them properly. But one thing we should bear in mind is they seem to be extremely long-lived." Carol gave a snort of derision. "Thank you for your insight, but I think everyone's aware of that. I mean, they lived at least as long as Arthur." "No, I mean really long-lived. Carla Orr has vouched for the fact that the one we call Morgan was trapped in closed cave systems for thousands of years. That's right, isn't it?" Hale addressed the question to Orr, who had been sitting with her arms folded over her chest, gazing sourly at the proceedings. "That's dweer Orr to you," was all she said in reply. "Assuming Orr is correct," Hale went on sweetly, "the only explanation I can think of for Morgan surviving and tolerating those conditions is that to her, or it, thousands of Earth years isn't a long time at all. Maybe her experience of the time passing was equivalent to our experience of a few hours or days, though, as I said, that's supposition. I'd rather not say any more at the moment. I don't want to prejudice impressions of these creatures if we ever encounter them, and I'm still going over the information we have on them." "Your input is much appreciated," said Carol. "If I might continue?" Hale sat down. Carol restarted his droning. Wright faded out, turning his attention to the attendees. Everyone of officer rank was here, including Corporal Abacha, as well as civilians Hale, Arthur, and Orr. He was glad Abacha was coming along. He would have to ask him if he'd seen Taylan before she left. The sight of her in the shuttle cabin sprang to his mind like an ember spitting from a fire. He'd hoped he would be able to get through the day of her departure without seeing her again, but Orr had put paid to that with her stupid antics. A bolt of agony and regret had passed through him. His only consolation was he'd been able to tell Talon didn't hate him for sneaking out without saying goodbye. She'd seemed to understand it would have been unbearable. It hadn't made seeing her again any less painful. Carol was chuckling, though his audience didn't share his amusement. "Of course, we might not be going anywhere. The engine testing is going well, with no major hiccups. However, it won't be until after the final check in 2 weeks we'll know for sure the mission will go ahead according to schedule. All non-essential personnel will wait aboard the shuttles while the test run takes place. You'll be there a few hours and it'll be cramped, but it can't be helped. Better safe than sorry." He checked his notes. "I think that's it. Any questions?" There was the usual pause, during which Wright hoped everyone else felt the same as him and didn't want to prolong the meeting. "Excellent," said Carol, turning off the holo. Thank you for your time." The lights brightened and the attendees began to stretch and get up. Wright sat motionless, lacking the energy to move. Carla Orr strode past him, bumping his shoulder, no doubt on purpose. But he didn't respond. He didn't have the motivation to deal with her right now. "I think she has it in for you." He looked up. Iolani Hale was standing next to him. "Or," Wright asked, "she hates my guts and the feeling's mutual." "Well, she hates everyone, but she seems to be singling you out in particular. She was looking daggers at you all through the meeting." "Was she? I didn't notice. It's because I'm supposed to keep her in check during the mission." "Oh no." Hale sat down. "Poor you. The trials of military life." "You can say that again." He was grateful for her friendliness. He'd spoken with Iolani a few times since she'd come aboard and had warmed to her. She was kind and gentle, yet also smart and witty. Her presence would be a boon during the voyage. "I'm glad you decided to come along," he said. "Thanks. I'm still not sure I made the right decision. It was enough of an upheaval in my life when I was helping Lorcan with his colonization project. I never intended to accept a place on it, and so never dreamed I would be leaving the solar system one day. But I can see how I could be useful if we do ever encounter these aliens. The Alliance is already making rookie mistakes." "You don't agree we should discount Alpha Centauri?" "No, I don't, as I was explaining to Carol." She sighed. But he ignored me. It's going to be an uphill battle to get them to listen. "I don't have much influence, but I'll do what I can to support you." Arthur appeared and straddled the chair in front of Wright so he could face them. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," he said to Hale. She burst out laughing. "I know who you are. I'm Iolani Hale." She reached out to shake his hand. Arthur gave a satisfied smile. "I'm feeling good about our quest. We have some good people with us." "So Talon isn't important after all?" Wright asked. "No, she is. She should be here, but she has a good reason to refuse. I'm not sure what that means." The king rested his forearms on the back of his chair. "In my former life, when my country was in turmoil, crops failing in the fields and my people starving, my knights and I set out to find the Sangreal. It was only through achieving a vision of it that things could be set right again. I have a feeling this endeavour is similar." "What was the Sangreal?" asked Iolani. "A holy vessel. Only a perfectly pure knight could achieve it. Unfortunately, nearly all of us are not pure." "But someone found it in the end?" A shadow passed over Arthur's face. "Yes, but at a great cost." Chapter 4. Someone had set up a vid screen in the shuttle cabin so the passengers could watch the FTL test of the Dauntless. Tension tightened as they watched, not only due to the momentous event, but also because everyone was crammed in like sardines. The Dauntless did carry shuttles and EEVs sufficient to hold her entire 200-person crew, but Carol hadn't wanted to deploy the emergency escape vessels unnecessarily, so anyone whose presence wasn't required during the test was forced to sit or stand aboard a shuttle. It seemed a slapdash and potentially dangerous decision to write. Sure, if the test failed and they were unable to reboard, the shuttles could transport everyone to Earth at a pinch, though it would be an uncomfortable journey. But it seemed wrong not to do things properly from the outset. On the other hand, the entire enterprise was a departure from normality for the Alliance. He stood at the rear of the shuttle where the aisle opened up, Abacha to his left and Iolani to his right. He felt sorry for the small woman, as there was no way she would be able to see anything except the backs of everyone in front of her. Unfortunately, Carla Orr was close by, in the aisle seat of the rear row. The rest of the row was empty. A batcher nodded at the back of her head and whispered, "Seems a bit unfair to make her come along on the mission." "Her?" Wright asked. "Why?" In the weeks following the briefing, he'd been meaning to ask a batcher if he'd managed to meet Talon before she left, but each time he remembered he still couldn't bring himself to talk about her. "Taking her away from her son," a batcher replied. "How long will it be before she sees him again?" Wright turned and squinted at him. "Are you feeling okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Though I wish they would get this damn test over with and let us return to the ship." "You must be the only non-Crusader in existence who feels the slightest sympathy for Carla Orr. When we get back to Earth, remind me I have a used car to sell you." A batcher shrugged. "She's still human at the end of the day, same as you and me." "I'm not sure about that. The interrogators couldn't get a lot out of her, but she seems to think she's descended from Morgan, one of the aliens." "She does? Could it be true?" "I don't know. Maybe. Stick around with Arthur for a while and you'll hear some crazy stuff. I thought it was all bullshit for a long time, but after what I've seen and heard, I don't know what to think anymore. I just want it all to be over." He caught himself before he said too much. A batcher was his subordinate, and he shouldn't be too familiar with him. But during their time on the Resolute, the lines had become blurred, as had many aspects of his service. Iolani had overheard him. She looked up and squeezed his arm in sympathy. "I'm actually a little excited now we're about to set off. I've warmed to the idea. I hope the test is successful. If it fails and they postpone or call off the mission, it's going to feel very anticlimactic." "You don't have long to wait," said Wright, peering at the vid screen. "The countdown is at 4 minutes 57 seconds. Unlike Hale, he was hoping the test failed. He wouldn't have minded if he'd had to return to Earth. He felt as though his time with the Royal Marines was coming to an end. If it wasn't for the need to defend human civilization against alien interference, he might have resigned. As it was, he couldn't turn away while he still had duties to perform. "I wish we were going to Proxima Centauri," Iolani said bitterly. "At 10 times light speed, we could be there in about 5 months. Imagine that! 5 months, and we could be the first human beings to set foot on an alien planet. And it isn't like life has been found at our destination. Lorcan's probes reported no signs of it. I don't know what experts the Alliance consulted when it made its decision to target an exoplanet purely because it has an atmosphere, but I wish I'd been one of them." "I wouldn't give up on Proxima," said Wright. "You never know what might happen once we're beyond the heliosphere. Until then, when we know how well the Dauntless protects us from interstellar space, nothing's set in stone. It could be Proxima is the only star we'll be able to make it to before conditions force us to turn back." "Yeah, that's going to be some day, isn't it?" a batcher commented. "When we become the first human beings to leave the solar system. It's great they figured out instant comms before we left. I can't wait to comm my family." It was remarkable the physicists had finally figured out how to use quantum entanglement to facilitate instantaneous communication. But Wright couldn't get excited about it. He wouldn't be comming anyone while on the voyage. The only person on Earth he wanted to speak to was Talon, but he wanted her to move on with her life while he was gone. He wasn't going to get in the way of her happiness. The noise in the cabin surged. "They started up the thrusters," said a batcher. Iolani stood on tiptoes and tried to peer over the heads. The blue flames from the Dauntless's thrusters shone out against the blackness of space. "I wish Lorcan was here," said Iolani. He would be so excited. "Doesn't he have a live feed?" asked Abacha. "Yes, but it isn't the same as being here," replied Iolani. "Not that I can actually see anything." The Dauntless was moving away at a rapid speed, and the cameras constantly adjusted to keep up with her dwindling image. It was possible the ship would be out of range before she shifted to FTL flight. Despite Wright's lackluster interest, that would be somewhat of a downer. "He's worked so many years for this moment," Iolani went on. "Honestly, it sent him crazy at times, and though we know the FTL drive works in probes, it isn't the same as using it to power a starship, right?" The countdown on the vid screen had reached single digits. "Here we go," said Abacha. 8, someone said. Immediately, people began to join in. 7, 6, 5, 4, said Abacha. 3, 2, said Iolani. 1! The shout resounded around the cabin. The Dauntless disappeared. That was it. 1 second she was there on the screen, silver-grey, oblong and bulky, with the warp generator protruding from her bow, and with weaponry and scanners in their protective casings protruding from her hull. The next she was gone. Stars shone from the place she'd occupied as if she'd never existed. A hush fell. "Did it work?" someone asked. Yes, the FTL drive had worked. Now travelling faster than light, no light from the Dauntless reached them. She was now invisible to regular sight, though the space-time warp created by the generator was detectable to scanners. It would only be while the FTL drive wasn't operating that her cloaking device would be effective, though even that was uncertain. Who knew what technological capabilities alien powers possessed? Wright leaned back against the bulkhead and watched the starscape on the screen. They had a few hours to wait before the Dauntless would make her way back to pick them up. The last chance that he wouldn't be going on the mission was gone. In another couple of days, they would set out. Humanity's first attempt to discover in person what lay beyond the boundaries of their star system would begin, and he would be a part of it. The knowledge left a sour taste in his mouth. In her aisle seat, Carla Orr was weeping. Chapter 5. A heated debate was going on in the briefing room. Carol had invited the high-ranking officers and a few civilian passengers to discuss what was, to some attendees, an important subject: crossing the line. The stupid thing was, crossing the line referred to crossing the Earth's equator at sea, not the heliopause where the solar wind gave out and interstellar space began. The Dauntless was approaching the area now, and Carol's idea was to mark the occasion with a similar tradition. Usually, crew who had never sailed over the equator were subjected to light hazing, such as meeting King Neptune and other silliness. Whatever equivalents Carol had thought up, Wright was in no mood for frivolities. He sat with his arms folded and waited for the meeting to be over. "We have to think of this in terms of the Roman gods," snapped Captain Johns. For some reason, she seemed particularly invested in the proposed ceremony. Representatives from all major branches of the military were aboard. For humanity's first step into the future of space exploration, the BI government had felt it best for the honour to be shared amongst those who had fought so hard and for so long to defend human civilization. Since starting out, Wright had made little effort to get to know the reps, but he recognised Major General Bobbin of the BA Army, a Canadian woman about Colburn's age, Royal Navy Commander Ryan Fletcher, and Group Captain Larson of the RAF. "Makes sense to me," Fletcher commented. Neptune was Roman, right? Mistakenly thinking Fletcher was talking to him, Wright looked up, but the officer was addressing the room generally. Yes, exactly, said Carol. Neptune was Roman. His Greek name was Poseidon. All right, said Fletcher. So who does the victim have to swear fealty to in this case? Sol? Bobbins said. I believe it's Sol Invictus, to be accurate. Sol Invictus, Fletcher echoed. Bit of a mouthful. We're getting away from the main subject, said a man with a drawling accent. Swearing allegiance is only a tiny part of the ceremony. It doesn't matter who they swear to, as long as it's someone dressed up in a wig and makeup, he guffawed. Wright didn't know his name, but he'd seen the man about the ship. It hadn't been until today he'd heard him speak. He was from one of the states, a southern one from the sound of his voice. A handful of guests from other countries had been invited to come along on the historic mission. Wright had guessed the man must be a wealthy businessman or perhaps a politician. He heard Larsen mutter, "And what would you know about it?" Considering Larsen was RAF, this was a bit rich. The group captain threw him a look, and Wright realised he must have unconsciously tutted. "First things first," said Carol. "First we decide on the god, then we move on to the ceremonies. Agreed?" This provoked general nods all around. "So," said Carol, "we have Sol Invictus. I would also suggest Aurora, the goddess of dawn, as a potential candidate, and Keylus." "Keylus," echoed Bobbin. "God of the sky. I like it." "Isn't Jupiter god of the sky?" asked Fletcher. "I'm sure that's right." "They both are," said Bobbin. "But Jupiter is the big cheese. He's already had a whole planet named after him. We should spread the love around a little." "I was going to propose Pluto," Larsen offered, "god of the underworld, considering we don't really know what we'll find on the other side. But if we're ruling out deities who already had a planet named after them—" "Pluto isn't a planet," the American interjected. "That's up for debate," Larsen countered. "No, it isn't," said the American, "and it hasn't been for a very long time." "As I understand it," Larsen said, an edge creeping into his tone, "the status of Pluto has long been—" "We're getting off topic," Carol interrupted. "But we can't in all fairness dismiss gods because they have a planet named after them. Neptune is the figure used in the original crossing the line ceremony." "Good point, Lieutenant General," said Larsen. Wright rolled his eyes. Larsen was such a brown nose, even to officers in other forces. "So we have Sol Invictus," Carol continued, "Aurora, Keylus, and Pluto. Any more suggestions before we take a vote?" Wright tuned out. He would much rather be alone, or if he had to spend time in company, with Arthur, Abacha, and Iolani. The four of them had formed a friendship that was about the only saving grace of this wretched mission. Technically, he should have been keeping an eye on Carla Orr during the active shift, but she rarely left her cabin, and he could hardly sit in there with her, making sure she was up to no good. What could she actually do, anyway? She had no access to weapons or secure areas like the bridge. Aside from inducing disgust and hatred wherever she went, she was powerless. "Major?" He looked up. Carol was staring at him, and so was everyone else. "You haven't voted," said the Lieutenant General. "Don't you have an opinion?" "No, I—" Colburn gave him a stern look. He cleared his throat. Aurora?" "Ah," Carol exclaimed, "you're my man. That makes her a clear winner. Aurora it is." "But it has to be a man," said the American. "You've gotta have a guy dressing up as a woman. You've just gotta." Aurora isn't a woman, Colburn said. She's a goddess, a female deity. Having a man dressing up as the opposite sex makes a mockery of the ceremony, Larson objected. That's the point, the American argued. It's supposed to be a joke. I'm so glad we have an expert among us, said Larson acidly. What would we do without you? It's no problem. Glad to help. The sarcasm had sailed right over the American's head. Yeah, like you know all about it, said Commander Fletcher to Larson. Now then, Carroll said diplomatically, all opinions are valued, especially our esteemed guests. We have chosen our mythological figure. Let's discuss the rites and rituals. Remember, we will be establishing a tradition that will be passed down through the ages. Whenever a member of the BA's military forces passes through the heliopause, they will be inducted into the exclusive ranks of voyagers in interstellar space. We must think this through carefully. The action should be symbolic, yet not too serious. Any thoughts, anyone? A barrage of suggestions erupted. Most of the attendees had an opinion on what the ceremony should entail. Carroll frowned as he tried to listen, but then gave up and waved his hands, trying to motion the speakers to silence. Wright surreptitiously slid out a pocket interface and checked the time. He lifted his eyebrows and gazed around the room. Everyone was chattering, if not to Carroll, then to their neighbour. The meeting was descending into chaos. Small arguments were breaking out. Even Colburn, who usually had no patience for vapid nonsense, was trying to make herself heard. Outside the briefing room, the lower ranks were performing their duties reliably and effectively. Arthur and Iolani were probably deep in conversation somewhere. Each found the other a fascinating source of information. Iolani wanted to know all about the plants and animals of Arthur's environment in his time, and he was surprisingly knowledgeable. Arthur was intrigued by Iolani's understanding of microorganisms. He had been entirely ignorant of their existence. If he was off duty, a batcher would be with them, probably enticing them to play him at Xiangqi. Wright watched his interface. The volume in the room decreased as Carroll slowly restored order. The mood had turned convivial. Perhaps the meeting wasn't as ridiculous as it had seemed. Maintaining good morale was important to the success of the mission. With so many disparate individuals aboard, along with the pressure of circumstances and purpose, tension would be high, and challenging situations could quickly ignite anger and conflict. No one knew what lay in wait beyond the sun's protective cloak. Merlin, Morgan, or another of their species could envelop the Dauntless as a black cloud and transport her millions of kilometres, scrambling the brains of everyone aboard. Anything could happen. Literally anything. What the interfering aliens had done defied humanity's understanding of the universe. Wright thought of Talon. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he found himself looking at the screen in the palm of his hand. Carroll was saying something about an obstacle course initiates must complete in their underwear. "Sir," Wright said, "if I might interrupt." "Oh, now you're interested," Carroll joked. "You don't want to be seen in your briefs, is that it?" The room filled with laughter. Even Colburn smiled. "No, sir, it's just... You're worried about younger men completing the course faster than you? I thought you got your dicky knee fixed." Wright clenched his jaw. "Sir, could I speak?" "Of course, Major. Go ahead." Carroll turned to Colburn as if to whisper something in her ear and ignore whatever Wright had to say. "We've already passed through the heliopause." Carroll turned back. "What?" "While everyone was talking, we crossed the heliopause." "But that isn't possible." The FTL drive is working better than expected. The predicted time for entering interstellar space has been moving forward for the last few hours. I'm sorry, sir. I thought you knew.
Well, Carol spluttered. No one told me. That's it? Asked the American. We're already here? No ceremony? Nothing? An awkward silence followed.
Chapter 6. On Earth, the passing of the Dauntless into interstellar space was widely celebrated. The people aboard her were able to view the parties, current affairs programs, and other commemorative occasions via comm. On the ship, however, the event had been anticlimactic. The attempt to organise shipboard ceremonies had failed in a dismal and embarrassing way, and everyday life had continued as normal. The Dauntless's hull dealt with the increased radiation levels well, and nothing else beyond the heliosphere seemed to pose an additional threat to human life. The astrophysicists took their readings and made their observations, but the information wasn't generally available. Wright found that, like his time on the Resolute, his greatest challenge was to stay occupied and fight off the encroaching boredom of long days with not very much to do. He wasn't high up enough to be responsible for important organisational tasks, nor lowly enough for menial housekeeping duties. Colburn seemed to think keeping watch on Orr would take up most of his time, but he was lucky to set eyes on her more than once per active shift. If she wasn't forced to leave her cabin to eat, he doubted he would see her at all. Orr wasn't who was on his mind most of the time. Arthur was. Though the king's mood appeared to have returned to normal after he had overcome his disappointment about Talon's decision to remain on Earth, his physical state seemed in decline. Wright had begun to notice the change in Arthur before he performed his disappearing act and caught a train to Cardiff. Grey hairs had appeared in his hair and beard, and faint lines were traced on his face. Before, the king had looked ageless. Now he definitely didn't look his real age of several thousand years, but Wright would have put him in his late 30s or early 40s. And as the days passed, Arthur continued to visibly age. Wright guessed he must have been in his early 30s when Merlin had somehow frozen his natural physical decline and mummified him in the mountain cave. People grew up young then and were lucky to make it to old age, yet he hadn't continued to age normally when he'd been brought back to life. He was growing old faster, as if catching up for lost time. Wright hadn't talked to him about it. There didn't seem to be much point. Who liked being told they were getting older? As far as he knew, no one else had mentioned it to Arthur either. Perhaps no one else had noticed. Then something else about Arthur changed. He arrived to eat dinner with Wright, Abacha and Iolani in the mess. As he walked up to the table, Wright vaguely noticed he looked different. When he studied Arthur more closely, he realised the king was chalk white. He watched him sit down and saw the man's hands tremble. Iolani had noticed his odd demeanour too. "Is everything okay?" she asked, pouring him a beaker of water. "You look like you saw a ghost." At the mention of the word ghost, Arthur started and looked around. He grabbed the beaker and gulped the contents. When he put the vessel down, he stared at it, his eyes unfocused. "Arthur?" Abacha gently nudged him. At his touch, the king started again, looked up, and saw all three of his companions gazing at him. He attempted a smile, though it was more of a grimace. "Nothing's wrong. Please don't be concerned." Something clearly was wrong, very wrong, but he wasn't about to tell them what it was. "What do you want to eat?" Wright asked, thinking a change of subject was in order. "The fish curry's good." "Yes, whatever you recommend." He passed a hand over his forehead and glanced around the mess once more. Wright walked up to the counter to get Arthur his meal. When he returned to the table, the king had regained his composure. He wasn't joining in with Iolani and Abacha's conversation, but the colour had returned to his face and he appeared calmer. "Have you seen Carla Orr lately?" Abacha asked Wright as he sat down. "Not today," he replied, putting down a plate in front of Arthur. "I saw her yesterday telling off the cook for not providing eggs at breakfast." Iolani chuckled. "No chickens aboard a military starship. Who would have thought?" "God knows what she used to expect from her crews," said Wright. "I hate to think. Probably ass's milk for her baths and fried lark's tongues for snacks." "Aren't you supposed to be looking after her?" Abacha asked. "Looking after her? More like stopping her from killing anyone. Have you forgotten about Boots on the Resolute?" Iolani frowned. "Boots? What's wrong with her wearing boots?" "Boots is the name of Talon's cat," Abacha explained. "I never met a less house-trained moggy." "Don't be too hard on him," said Wright. "At least, not if Talon's around. If you know what's good for you. He got better anyway. I'd say 9 out of 10 success rate at hitting the kitty litter." "What did Orr do to the cat?" asked Iolani. "Tried to kill him, of course," Wright replied. She gasped, then said, "I like the way you say 'of course,' like it was a natural conclusion." "Isn't it? What else does she do except complain and spread death and destruction wherever she goes? The woman's a walking, talking blight on living things." "I wonder what made her like that," asked Abacha. "Does anything have to have made her like that?" Wright countered. "Isn't it possible she was just born that way?" "I heard she grew up on the streets of Berlin," said Abacha. "And," asked Wright, "she wouldn't have been the only one. Did they all turn into megalomaniacal psychopaths? No," he added, without waiting for Abacha's reply. "They didn't." While they'd been talking, Arthur had been mechanically eating his dinner. He put down his fork and said, "You're forgetting Morgan's influence on her. If you must place blame for someone's actions, TJ, place it on the true originator of the evil, Morgan Le Fay." Wright snorted with incredulity. "Come on, are you saying Orr had no free will? She chose to listen to Morgan because it suited her. They both wanted the same things. Orr was the one who freed Morgan from captivity too, don't forget. Why would she free someone who was controlling her?" "It was probably a mistake," said Arthur. "Morgan would have tricked her." "Why is everyone so full of excuses for Carla Orr all of a sudden?" asked Wright. "First Abacha's blaming her genocidal behavior on poverty and deprivation, and now you're telling me everything she did was Morgan's fault." "Not entirely," said Arthur. "No," said Abacha. "I'm just saying things aren't black and white. Human beings are complicated." "Never a truer word spoken," said Iolani. "Give me microbes any day. Nice and easy to understand, usually. Would anyone like dessert?" She began to stand up, but before she was upright, an alarm blasted out. She winced and raised her shoulders. "What's that?" she shouted over the noise. At the same time, Wright received a comm via his implant. "Security breach." He ran from the mess. Naturally, Orr was behind it, and also naturally, Colburn had reached her before Wright and was ready and waiting with an accusatory stare by the time he arrived. Orr was under restraint in the passageway outside the FTL drive control room. He learned she'd been inside the room, though no one seemed to know how she got in. There were no guards posted, but a high-level security panel prevented unauthorized entry. No one had seen any need for greater security. Why would anyone want to tamper with the operation of the drive? It could be insanely dangerous for everyone aboard. including the person doing the tampering. They'd underestimated awe and the suicidal tendencies of her cult. 2 operators had been present in the room with her. If it hadn't been for the arrival of a 3rd operator as the shift switched, Awe might have succeeded in whatever she was there to do. At the sight of the former Dwyer, the 3rd operator had immediately raised the alarm without waiting for an explanation from his colleagues. There could be no rational explanation for her presence near the sensitive vital equipment except that she meant to do harm. The 3rd operator had wrestled her outside and restrained her until Wright's arrival. He took over from the man and listened to his story. Awe was limp and unresistant. Colburn was furious, judging by the set of her jaw. "When support arrives," she snapped, "I want you to return her to her cabin and set an armed guard. She'll stay there until a decision is made regarding her long-term status on the ship. My recommendation will be she is confined in the brig for the duration of the voyage." "Yes, ma'am." The daggers from Colburn's eyes accused him of failing in his duty, but she didn't verbalise her reprimand, no doubt due to the presence of others. "See me in my office as soon as you're free," said the Brigadier. That would be when he would have strips torn off him. 2 Marines appeared at the end of the passageway. Wright pushed Awe toward them and they set off. "You're going to space me, aren't you?" Awe asked. "What? No. Did you hear what Brigadier Colburn said? I'm taking you to your cabin." "You said you would space me if I stepped out of line." One of the Marines glanced at him. "I'm going to do exactly as ordered," Wright retorted. "You'll wait for a chance to get me to an airlock," said Awe. "You'll bribe the guards to turn a blind eye, and that'll be it." "You're talking nonsense." "But I won't die," Awe went on. There was a new tone in her voice that caused Wright to stare at her. It was a note of sadness and self-pity he'd never heard from her before, not in the many days of her obnoxious presence in his life. The tone evoked a twinge of sympathy. Damn it! They didn't understand what a truly despicable person she was. He didn't want to even speak to her, but curiosity overcame his resolve. "What do you mean you won't die?" "Only Arthur can kill me." "Oh, believe me, space will kill you." "Not," he added, mindful of the 2 Marines, "that I plan on putting you out of the ship." "No, it won't. Nothing will. That's what Morgan told me. She said I am inviolable, and I believe her. Except against Arthur. Merlin gave him special powers to break through my defense." "I don't know what you're talking about," Wright replied. In fact, he did. Arthur wasn't affected by pulse rounds. It was possible Morgan had done something similar to Awe, though whether the aliens' protections were effective now they were gone was another matter. "It will be like when Morgan trapped me in my mind," Awe went on. "I will float in space, unable to hear or touch anything, unable to do anything. Except this time I'll see. I'll see the stars. I won't be able to bring my life to an end. I'll be forced to live like that until I die of old age, alone and insane." The melancholy underlying her words set Wright's nerves on edge. "Please don't space me," she asked him. "Ask Arthur to kill me with his sword. That will do it. Only give me time to write to Perrin first, and deliver the letter when you get back. I don't think that's too much to ask." They'd arrived at her cabin at last. Wright thumbed the door release and told the guards to put her inside. She turned and caught him with a desolate glare. He shivered, unable to look away until the closing door severed their gazes. Chapter 7. or had been taken from her cabin and confined to the brig. Weeks had passed, and Wright's only occupation now was to ensure the Marines under his command fulfilled their duties. They were exemplary men and women, otherwise they wouldn't have been picked for the mission, so he had very little to do. He found himself spending more and more time with Iolani. She was similarly bored. Her role was to advise on extraterrestrial life forms they encountered, and there was no chance of that happening, at least until they explored the destined planet, perhaps never. He would often meet her in the briefing room, which doubled as an entertainment lounge for non-military and off-duty military personnel. But they would only go there if the place was comparatively empty, when no vids or hollows were playing and no one had organised a game night or other distraction. Otherwise, they would go to the mess between mealtimes. He craved peace and quiet, and Iolani seemed to feel the same. He liked to listen to her talk about her work and Suriname, the country where she'd lived for many years, before Talman hired her as a consultant. In turn, she would ask him about his life as a Marine. He only told her funny stories, like the sweepstake Lieutenant Ford had run on the Resolute, betting on how many words Kroll would say at one time before they reached the BI. There was no benefit to either of them in telling her what being in the military was really like. She didn't need to hear about the retaking of Jamaica or his nightmares and flashbacks. One day, when they were in the lounge, she asked him about Arthur. Only 2 other groups of people were in there. The man from the States, who had been at the ridiculous crossing the line ceremony meeting, was with Major General Bobbin and another North American, and 4 off-duty ship's technicians sat together drinking beer. "Is it really true Arthur was dead when you found him?" Iolani suddenly asked. They'd been talking about the king's apparent physical decline. Iolani had noticed it too. But, like Wright, she didn't know what to do about her observation. "Is that the rumour?" Wright asked. "No, he wasn't dead. He only looked dead. My HUD told me he was alive, though just barely." "Your HUD?" "Heads-up display on my helmet visor." "Ah, I see. Your suit scanned him." "Exactly. We can scan for vital signs." He didn't elaborate. "It's astounding, isn't it?" "That he stayed alive for so long. I didn't believe it myself for a long time, even though I was there when he recovered. He looked like a mummy at first, but within days he'd transformed to a normal, healthy adult man. It was only when Merlin turned up that things began to make sense. I think it's clear the alien did something to Arthur to keep him alive." "There are creatures on Earth that have survived longer than Arthur," said Iolani. "Organisms frozen for tens of thousands of years, then revived. So it's possible, though I can't imagine how it would work for human beings." "Arthur wasn't frozen, only dried up. It was cold in the cave, but not below freezing." "Scientists have managed to sprout seeds that are thousands of years old. I wish I'd been there when Arthur was found. I could have learned so much. It's a shame the doctors on your ship didn't contact someone qualified to study what was happening." "It was all top secret at the time," said Wright. "The medics probably kept records and you could apply to read them, but to be honest, it's unlikely you would get permission." "That's what I thought." Iolani chewed her lip. Wright was quiet too. On the other side of the room, one of the Americans guffawed. Iolani looked up and held his gaze without speaking. Suddenly, the atmosphere between them shifted. He began to feel uncomfortable. Shit. He'd been hanging out with Iolani almost daily for a long time. Sometimes Arthur or Abacha was with them, sometimes both of them were, but the constant had been he and Iolani. Had he been leading her on? He didn't think so, but he couldn't be sure. Yet they were both single, and she was an attractive woman who, as far as he knew, wasn't close to anyone else on the ship. TJ, Her voice petered out. Perhaps she'd read the panic on his face. He should set her straight, but how to do it? He was terrible at anything like this, entirely out of practice. He rubbed the top of his head. Iolani. A dreadful moaning came from the passageway. The lounge door was closed, but the sound penetrated the room, silencing everyone. Wright stared at the doorway. What the? The sound was almost inhuman, though no other living things were aboard. Had ore escaped from the brig? The noise was deep-pitched, but her voice was low for a woman. Whoever it was, she or he sounded utterly terrified. The door slid open, activated automatically by movement outside. Arthur stumbled in backwards. It was he who had been making the ghastly noise. His arms flailing, he fell to the floor. He turned on his front and began to crawl from the open doorway, his features fixed by abject horror. Arthur was not easily scared. Wright had seen him fight. What was the cause of his dismay? A giant whooping gasp came from his left, and Iolani's fingers dug into his arm. Then he saw it too. A figure was floating into the room, wispy, almost transparent, and entirely white. It was the image of a tall, slim woman. She was dressed in the style of Arthur's time, a long robe falling to her feet, pulled in at her waist by a slim belt. Her hair hung down her back from her high forehead. Her near invisibility made it hard to see the detail of her face, but she seemed beautiful. Arthur had crawled as far as he could go. He sat on the deck, his back against the bulkhead, his arms crossed protectively over his eyes and his head averted. "Holy shit," whispered Major General Bobbin. Wright then heard her mumble as she spoke into her comm, and he realized with a start he should be doing the same. But what should he say? "Major Wright to control. Ghost in the briefing room. I repeat, ghost in the briefing room." Arthur's tormentor was hanging over him, the king clearly visible through her gown. She seemed to be trying to speak to him. Her hands gestured smoothly and gently, as if she was explaining something. "No!" Arthur exclaimed. "No! I will not heed you! You are dead! You are long dead!" He continued to speak, but not in English. He'd switched to his original language. There was a sudden movement as the four techies sprang for the door. Wright remembered Iolani was a civilian. "Get behind me," he told her, placing a hand on his sidearm. "I don't think it's dangerous," she said. "It seems to want to communicate." He moved in front of her anyway, but the thing was already fading. It continued to move its arms and hands, but it was growing rapidly fainter. Within seconds, it had vanished. Wright crossed the room to Arthur, who was a trembling wreck. "It's gone," he reassured him. "Whatever the hell that thing was, it's gone. You don't have to be afraid." The king's eyes remained wild with fear, and his breathing was ragged. "Should I call a medic?" Wright asked. "No." Arthur swallowed. "No, I am not unwell." He breathed more deeply, and his facial muscles lost some of their rigidity. He was staring at the door, seeming to expect the ghost to return any minute. He switched focus to Wright. "You saw it too?" Iolani had joined them. "We all did." Tension melted from Arthur. "I thought I was going mad. I thought I was imagining her." "You've seen it before?" Wright asked. Then he recalled the time in the mess when Arthur had appeared to have received a shock of some kind. "I have seen her several times. Usually I would run away.
This was the first time she followed me. I thought she would never leave me."
Iolani asked, "Do you know who it was?"
"I know who it looks like. It resembles my queen. Every detail perfect, exactly as I remember her. But it is not her. Not unless Merlin preserved her too, and I'm sure he didn't. He never liked Guinevere. No, if you can see it too, it is a phantasm, perhaps created by Morgan Le Fay. It was sent here to strike fear into my heart. I thought she only appeared in my imagination, not in reality." "She's as real as ghosts get," said a voice.
The American who had been at the meeting was peering at Arthur. 2 armed Marines burst in. Bobbin's comm had drawn a response.
"The crisis is over," Wright told them. "You can return to duty."
Arthur sank his face into his hands.
"What am I to do, TJ? What am I to do?"
Chapter 8. Wright moved into Arthur's cabin. It was a squeeze. There was no room for another bunk, so he had to sleep on a mattress on the deck. The king had wanted to swap places with him, but Wright insisted on taking the less comfortable option. It was no great inconvenience, especially not compared to fielding the vision of Guinevere that kept appearing. She didn't turn up frequently, but when she did, it always seemed to be when least expected. One time late in the quiet shift, Wright had woken to see the figure faintly luminescent hovering directly above him. She had seemed to want Arthur as she always did, but luckily he'd remained sound asleep. Another time she appeared to Arthur while he was in the shower. He came barreling out into the main cabin yelling his head off, stark naked and soaking wet. That time she only stuck around a couple of minutes before disappearing. There was nothing Wright could do to protect him. The phenomenon occurred randomly, with no warning or precursors, and nothing affected it. It couldn't be touched, and pulse rounds passed through it. None of the scientists aboard could even hazard a guess about what the spectre was. They had rigged up Arthur's cabin with cameras and sensors, but all the information they'd gleaned was a slight increase in the atmospheric electrical charge whenever the apparition appeared. No black clouds in the surrounding space accompanied it, so Arthur's theory it was something to do with the aliens Morgan or Merlin remained unsupported. Despite the repetition of the visits, Arthur's terror didn't abate. Each time he encountered the thing, he acted as shocked and horrified as he'd been in the briefing room, whereas Wright had found the ghost disturbing at first, but he grew more curious about the figure than frightened by it. He guessed the king's reaction had something to do with his religious background. He had a deep-seated fear of anything that seemed evil or demonic, and there was also the fact the apparition looked like his dead wife. So the days passed, Wright keeping Arthur company while waiting for another visit from Guinevere's ghost. He'd tried to engage the king in conversation about the queen once or twice, but he'd quickly given up after it became clear how painful the subject was to him. Wright knew too well how hard affairs of the heart were to put into words. He hadn't managed to speak to Iolani about her take on their friendship, which he suspected she felt was something more. Perhaps it was for the best. Between Arthur and the life scientist, he'd almost forgotten about Carla Orr. It had been a relief to put her out of his mind while she'd been confined to the brig. So it was a surprise and a harsh return to reality when Colburn's sharp command arrived in his head. "Major, attend Orr in the brig immediately. She's kicking off about something, and the guards can't get her under control." "Yes, Brigadier." He excused himself to Arthur and sped from the cabin. The brig was a 2-minute jog away. When Wright arrived, Orr was covered in blood and wrestling with 2 guards in her cell. The place was awash with blood too, and the three were slipping and sliding on it as they fought. "She tried to top herself," one of the guards explained. "Are medics on their way?" he asked. Colburn must have misunderstood the nature of the emergency. "Yeah, we called them first," said the other guard. "You must have been nearer." Before she had finished her sentence, a medical team ran in. Wright stepped up to Orr, who was struggling with a wild frenzy. One guard was attempting to get her arm behind her back, but it was slick with blood, and Orr seemed to have the strength of a couple of men. The other guard was on her knees, holding Orr's thighs in a bear grip. "Get her on the deck," Wright snapped. He grappled the former Dwyer around her hips and lifted her struggling body off her feet. She lashed out with both legs, and he fought to maintain his grip on her torso. Her clothes were soaked in blood. There was so much of it, it was hard to tell where it was coming from. Hadn't she said she couldn't die? That only Arthur could put an end to her life? If she really thought that, what was the point of what she'd been attempting? The guard at her back forced her forward, and the three of them managed to lay her on her front. "Turn her over," said a medic. Orr's utterances had been mostly incoherent until now. As Wright rolled her, she screamed, "Don't touch me! How dare you touch me! Get your hands off me, you disgusting wretches!" She worked her mouth as if preparing to spit. Wright clamped a hand over it to prevent her, but also to shut her up. "Does anyone know where she's cut?" the medic asked. "Wrists, I think," said a guard. The other medic arrived with a pressure hypodermic and thrust it into her bicep, depressing the button. Orr's eyes rolled back and her body went limp. "Phew!" a guard exclaimed, releasing her hold. "Thank fuck for that!" She stiffened and glanced at Wright. "Sorry, sir." "Never mind." He stood up. Smears of Orr's blood covered his uniform. The medics moved in, turning over her arms to examine her wrists. Deep gashes marked them. A metre or so away, a jagged piece of plastic lay on the deck, one edge wet and red. It looked like it had been broken from a food tray. "What happened?" he asked. The guard who had sworn replied, "I gave her her food about half an hour ago. When I checked to see if she'd finished, I saw her on her bunk and a pool of blood on the floor. I raised the alarm and asked Jarvis here for assistance. We went in to try to stop the bleeding until medical could get here, but, well, you saw how she reacted, sir." "Yeah," the other guard remarked. "She was serious, not attention-seeking." "She certainly was," a medic commented. "She went down to the bone on this arm." Colburn calmed him. "Sit rep, Major. The situation's under control, ma'am. It was a medical emergency. Attempted suicide." "Attempted? So she's still alive?" "For now, ma'am. I expect you'll receive a report soon." "Good. I wouldn't want her dying on us while she still might be useful." The coldness of Colburn's words hit him. While she still might be useful? Wright looked down on Orr, unconscious and pale where she wasn't bloody. She'd lost considerable weight since the last time he'd seen her weeks ago. What had driven her to try to take her own life? After her attempt to sabotage the FTL drive, she'd been scared he would space her, but he hadn't. He'd left her alone in the brig. She had to know by now she was safe from him. So what else was bothering her? Was she missing her position as Dwyer? Was life meaningless to her if she wasn't adored and worshipped by millions? Or was she missing her son? "She's stable," said a medic. "Let's get her on the gurney." "She put up a heck of a fight considering the state she's in," the other remarked as they lifted her. "She's lucky to be alive. Look at that blood. Gotta be a couple of litres here." The other nodded. "At least. Come on, let's get her to the bay." A gasp from one of the guards made them pause. Then Wright saw it too. An apparition, like the one Arthur had been seeing, had appeared near Orr's bunk. Except it was not exactly like Arthur's. It was white, faintly luminous, and nearly transparent, But it didn't look like Guinevere. The image was of a small man, bent with age. A straggly beard adorned his face, and long, thin, unkempt hair hung to his shoulders. He wore a knee-length nightshirt and a single fluffy slipper. The figure floated toward where Orr lay on the gurney. "Shoot it!" yelled a medic, dragging the gurney toward the door. "No point," said Wright. The spectre of the man halted and hovered over Orr. The translucent lines of its lips moved, but no sound came out. All that could be heard was the laboured breathing of the spectacle's witnesses. The medics hastily departed with Orr. The apparition didn't follow. "What shall we do, sir?" asked a guard. "Nothing. It should disappear soon." Even as he spoke, the edges of the old man were becoming less distinct. "I heard about what happened in the briefing room," said the guard. "Never thought I'd see it myself. What's it doing here, I wonder?" Wright was wondering if it had something to do with Orr's attempted suicide. Arthur had certainly been driven to distraction by the phenomenon. It seemed significant that he and Orr, both of whom had been close to Merlin and Morgan respectively, should be the targets of these visits. Chapter 9. She'd called him into her office to discuss the ongoing strategy regarding Orr. He felt like asking, "Why me?" "Yes, Brigadier." "She's extremely unstable according to her medical report, but Dr. Kim won't allow anyone except the patient in her office during treatment sessions, unfortunately. I explained the risks, but she isn't having it, and sadly we don't have any facilities that would give the doctor the necessary protection. No one imagined our resident psychiatrist would be dealing with dangerous patients." Orr had been put on suicide watch and would be returning to the brig today. Her cell had been fitted out with the same equipment as Arthur's cabin in case Orr's apparition returned. "So I'll wait outside?" he asked. "Exactly." Why she wanted him at Orr's psychiatric assessment, he couldn't understand. A couple of tough armed guards would do. But the Brigadier had associated him with Orr ever since he'd brought the woman to the BI on the Resolute. Maybe that was it. Or maybe Colburn thought he might be useful in a psychiatric crisis due to his own problems. "Yes, ma'am." "Now." "I'm sorry?" "She's being escorted to see Kim now." "Oh, I see." Colburn bent her head to scan her interface, dismissing him with her body language. He left and headed for Dr. Kim's office. The psychiatrist was alone. He'd arrived before Orr. "Hello, Major. Please, sit down." "But—" "We have a few minutes. I'd like to talk to you, see how things are going." Colburn's intention became clear. She'd hoodwinked him. Resigned, he lowered himself into the empty seat. Kim sat across from him. The doctor was gangly, dressed in civilian clothes, her short black hair peppered grey. She crossed one leg over the other at the knee. "We don't have long," she said, "so I'll come straight to the point. I'm surprised and a little concerned that you haven't been to see me yet." He sighed. "Given my history, you mean?" She nodded. "I haven't felt any need." "You were advised to attend regular psychiatric evaluations. It isn't a punishment, you know. This is for your own well-being and that of those under your command." He stiffened. "No one in my command has ever been in any danger from me." "You misunderstand. To exercise sound judgment, an officer must be of sound mind." "I am of sound mind." She fixed him with her gaze. "In your opinion, I'm sure you are. Most people feel the same, regardless of their mental status. How have you been sleeping lately?" "Well enough." "Still getting flashbacks?" He let out a long breath. "Occasionally, but I can deal with them." "Thank you for being honest. That's a good sign. The methods you were taught at the clinic are working for you?" "Yes." "Mostly." "Good. You remember how to self-assess, to
to tell if things are getting bad again?"
"Yes."
She smiled tightly. "Right, that's it. I only wanted to touch base with you and remind you I'm here if you need me. Your responsibilities with Carla and now Arthur have put you under a lot of pressure. It can't be easy for you." She got to her feet and walked to the door. When it slid open, she looked out. No sign of her. "We still have a little time." Sitting down again, she continued, "To be honest, Major, I asked Colburn to send you here early so I could squeeze in a quick consult. I'm absolutely snowed under, and I didn't want to ask you to wait for an appointment if you needed one."
"You've had lots of requests for treatment?"
"Yes, and plenty of treatment orders. As I was saying, many don't realize they may have a problem." He was puzzled. The Dauntless's crew were the best the Alliance had to offer, and the passengers would have been psychologically vetted before they were allowed aboard. "I know what you're thinking," said Kim. "How come I'm in so much demand? I've wondered about that as well. I expected to be bored on this long voyage with few people who might need my help. But the opposite is the case. I'm rushed off my feet. My waiting list is a week long."
"What sort of problems are you seeing, if you don't mind my asking?"
"Depression, apathy, interpersonal tension, lack of affect, anxiety. I don't have anything concrete yet, but—" The door to her office opened. Orr stood between two guards, or rather she sagged, and they held her upright by her arms. She looked ghastly. The apparition that had appeared in her cell had looked healthier. Her wrists were bound with dressings. Wright vacated his seat as the guards brought Orr over.
"I'll wait outside."
Dr. Kim spent longer than an hour with her, despite her assertion that she was busy. Her next appointment, a young officer cadet, arrived. She flushed when she saw Wright and the two guards and retreated several meters down the passageway. As Wright kicked his heels, he mulled over the odd phenomena of the two apparitions, one striking terror into its subject, the other driving its target to suicidal despair. The Dauntless was months into her long journey, but she had months of FTL travel ahead of her too. What kind of state would Arthur and Orr be in by the time they arrived if the ethereal visits continued? He was well past bored of waiting when Kim's office door eventually opened and Orr appeared. She didn't look a whole lot better than she had when she'd gone in. Maybe she seemed a tad less melancholy. He walked with her and the guards to the brig. When they reached it, he stepped into her cell and asked the guards to wait outside. She flopped onto her bunk and curled up into a fetal position, her back toward him.
"Carla, How dare you," she murmured. "You shall address me as—" She exhaled, long and soft. "I want to ask you about the thing that appeared after you cut your wrists." Silence. "I'm guessing it wasn't the first time it's been here. Was that why you wanted to die? Because you couldn't stand it anymore?" Nothing. He waited, hoping she might say something, even if it was only to tell him to leave her alone. "Are you aware something has been visiting Arthur too?" he asked eventually. "We've been wondering if it's something to do with Morgan, or perhaps Merlin. Do you think she could be sending these things into the ship in order to terrorize both of you?" Orr remained quiet and still, her chest barely moving with her respirations. She wasn't asleep. He was sure of it. They needed all the information they could get on these strange beings repeatedly appearing within the ship. If Orr knew or just guessed something, he needed to know. "The one that visits Arthur is always in the shape of his former queen," he said. "Is your visitor the same? Do you recognize it? Is the old man someone you know or used to know?" After several seconds, an almost inaudible "yes." He perked up. "You know him?" Orr didn't answer. Perhaps that was all he was going to get.
"Is the man still alive?" he asked. It probably wasn't important, but he wanted to get her talking again. "Or is he dead, like Guinevere?"
Her chest expanded as she took a deep breath. She turned onto her back and stared at the overhead as she answered, "Dead."
"What was your relationship with him?"
Tears slid from her eyes to her pillow.
"He was a friend, an old friend."
A friend? He couldn't imagine her having friends. Sycophants, yes. Hangers-on, sure. People too scared to tell her what they really thought of her, of course. But a genuine friend? She had to be mistaken.
"Do you know what's behind these visits? Did Morgan ever create something like that?"
She swallowed.
"I don't know what's behind them. Morgan could be doing it. I don't know why she would, but she's capable of many things. Is there anything you can tell me that might help us understand what's happening?"
He waited, but she only continued to stare into the middle distance, not speaking. Did she know something but was refusing to answer? Or was she really as ignorant as everyone else? If she really wanted to die, maybe she simply didn't care what happened. And she was Carla Orr, who famously didn't give a shit about others anyway. He watched her, but then he turned his attention to the small cell. The blood from her suicide attempt had been cleaned away, and the Sanobots must have removed any specks the cleaners had missed. The place was bare, sterile, and nearly empty. How many meters stood between Orr and he and the hull? 10 or 12, he guessed. And then beyond the hull was the vastness of interstellar space. They were already light years from Earth, wrapped in the warp bubble that allowed them to slip through the black at unimaginable speed. They had light years to travel before they would arrive at their destination, a place inhabited by nothing more than microbes at best, and which was hostile to human life. 200 souls, ensconced in a vessel not even as large as a speck on the cosmic scale. Tiny, unimportant living beings whose lifespans were perhaps no more than seconds compared to their alien tormentors, according to Iolani. If the FTL drive were to explode and wipe them all out in an instant, the event would be utterly inconsequential in galactic terms. They were meaningless and alone in the expanse. Orr was looking at him. Across the boundless distance between their backgrounds, beliefs, desires and motivations, his hatred for the odious, abhorrent human being eased a notch. Chapter 10. Wright was walking through the streets of downtown Jamaica. His platoon had escaped the barricade set by the EAC forces with the help of the Jamaican resistance, and they were on their way to the field hospital set up at the ambassador's residence. As he walked, he scanned carefully for hostiles. Crusaders were notoriously suicidal and would take ridiculous risks to attack the Alliance. They were all over the city too. Small cells remaining in many places, refusing to surrender. He spotted a familiar figure ahead. Sometimes identifying his men and women by sight wasn't easy. Their armour and tinted visors made them anonymous. But this figure was smaller than most and bore the stripe of her rank on her shoulder. He switched his HUD to show each Marine's name to check. It was her. He was confused. Something wasn't right, but he wasn't sure what. Why was he surprised to see her here? He ran forward. Patel was walking between two comrades, her rifle across her chest. The three Marines seemed to be talking on a private comm channel, perhaps kidding around or gossiping. He tried to comm her directly, but she didn't answer. He grabbed her shoulder. He needed to check it was Patel and figure out what she was doing here when her visor was up. Her face was gone. Where there should have been eyes, nose, a mouth and chin, skin bones, skin, was a charred, gaping hole. He screamed. "TJ!" Hands were on him, shaking him. He opened his eyes on darkness. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Another nightmare." "I know," said Arthur. "I know, but look." Wright blinked as he tried to focus. The dream was one that had haunted his sleeping hours for months. He didn't know when or if he would ever be rid of it. He wanted to remember Patel as the smart, eager, loyal, determined young woman she'd been before she died. He wanted to remember her smile and the flash of her eye, not the horror of her corpse as he'd caught her in his arms. "Look," Arthur insisted. Wright became aware of a glow in what should have been the pitch black of the cabin. He groaned. Guinevere was back again. But Arthur seemed unusually calm about it. Perhaps he was getting used to the visits. Wright rubbed his eyes and squinted into the dark. The figure hung over them, its lines softly glowing. Except it wasn't Guinevere. It was a man, but not the one who had appeared in Carla Orr's cell. This one was middle-aged and wearing a suit. A band fastened around Wright's throat. He choked out a gasp. Above him floated his father. He hadn't set eyes on him since his 18th birthday. He'd never looked at a picture of him or watched him in a family vid. He'd got rid of everything pertaining to his parents the moment they'd dismissed him from their lives. All he had of them were memories from his childhood. What did it mean? Was his dad dead? He looked the same as he had the last time he'd seen him. Why was the thing appearing to him? Had Morgan or Merlin invaded his mind and stolen the image to create a vision to scare him? "Light," said Arthur. The cabin light came on. The apparition faded in competition with the brightness, but it didn't go away. This one wasn't attempting to communicate. Its mouth and hands were still. It only watched him. Then it was gone. "I'm sorry," Arthur said. "I'm sorry it's happening to you too." Wright reached for his shirt and pulled it on. There would be no more sleep for him tonight. "It isn't your fault. I wish I knew what the hell those things are." "Perhaps they are from hell." "What do you mean?" Arthur lay down on his bed and put his hands behind his head. "I've been wondering something, TJ. Do you think maybe we're in hell? I used to think hell was beneath the surface of the earth, somewhere deep below, from where volcanoes spurt their fire. But what if it is here, beyond the sky, among the stars? What if the priests are wrong, and heaven isn't high up, but low down, or in another place? What if we've left the kingdom of God behind, and we're travelling into a demonic region?" Wright stared at him. "You certainly know how to put the wind up someone." "I'm just thinking aloud." "I'd appreciate it if you would keep those thoughts to yourself. Things are bad enough around here as it is. Morale's low, and most of the crew and passengers are jittery and stressed from what I've heard. The last thing we need is someone putting the idea they might be in hell into their heads. Stars!" He pushed down his blankets and stood up before pulling on his pants. His hands trembled. He was already shaken up by his nightmare and his father's apparition, let alone Arthur's belief they were in some kind of medieval underworld. "Major Wright!" He grimaced. One day he would resign from the Royal Marines, get his damned implant removed, and his head would be his own again. "Yes, Brigadier." "Glad you're awake. There's a disturbance in the briefing room. You're the nearest officer. Get over there immediately and make sure you're armed. Shots have been fired. I'm on my way." "Yes, ma'am." He quickly put on his boots and, telling Arthur not to leave his cabin, ran into the passageway. All seemed quiet in the briefing room, though for some reason the door stood open. Light shone into the passageway. Wright estimated it was about 0300 hours. The room should have been empty. No entertainments would be scheduled at this late hour, and most passengers would be asleep. Any crew who were awake would be on duty. He crept closer, his beamer at the ready. Lying on the deck just inside the doorway was a man on his back, arms splayed out. He wasn't military. Wright couldn't see any movement of his chest. That was all he could tell. One of his knees was bent and lying in the doorway, which explained why the door was open. The sensors were picking up the object in close proximity. Murmuring just above a whisper, he requested medical support. It was probably already on the way, but it wouldn't hurt to make sure. "Who's out there?" barked a voice. "It took you long enough. Who is it?" Wright recognised the voice, but he couldn't put a name to it. The speaker was male, and his accent was upper class, clipped and confident. The answer came.
"Larson?" he asked. "Is that you?"
"Well done, Major Wright. You've got it in one. Show your face so I can see you. It isn't polite to shout around corners." It was RAF Group Captain Larson, who had argued so vehemently at the Crossing the Line meeting.
"What are you doing, Larson?" Wright asked. "Who's that lying in the doorway?"
"Guess." He heard movement behind him. Colburn had appeared at the end of the passageway. 2 medics crowded behind her. He motioned with his hand for all of them to stay back. "Sit rep, Major," came Colburn's request over his comm. He replied very softly,
"One civilian is down. Group Captain Larson seems to be responsible. Still assessing the situation."
"A section is on its way," she replied. "Approaching from starboard. I'll tell them to halt once they see you and await further orders. Iolani Hale is in there too. I don't know who else."
"Hale?"
"She's the one who got the comm out to the bridge. That's all I know." "I'm still waiting, Wright," Larson said. "Don't tell me you don't know who it is I helpfully eradicated from the manifest."
"You killed someone?"
"No, I killed something. There are things living among us, and they must be eradicated. They're the ones responsible for the strange appearances. I haven't figured out what they're doing yet or why, but I will get to the bottom of it."
"What are you talking about?" Wright asked. "I don't understand."
"If you don't understand, maybe you're part of the problem." He had a sudden brainwave.
"Brigadier," he conned, "I need a helmet."
"Copy, and Dr. Kim is on her way." It was a smart call from Colburn. Larson did appear to be having some kind of psychotic break. The section of 5 Marines appeared at the other end of the passageway and quickly stopped as they saw Wright. They were suited up and armed.
"I want to speak to Iolani," he said.
"You want to speak to Miss Hale? I'm not sure why. Are you two colluding in the subterfuge? I was so sure it was only the civilian passengers. Perhaps I was wrong."
"Larson, you've already killed an innocent person. Don't make things worse for yourself. Let Iolani go and anyone else you have in there with you. Give yourself up and we can get you some help."
"I don't need anyone's help," spat Larson. "I'm doing you all a favour. Why can't you see that? I'm helping you by identifying the aliens and eradicating them."
"How do you know you haven't killed an innocent man?"
"I worked it out by logical deduction. Every military person on this ship is Alliance. We've pledged our loyalty and would never do anything to harm the mission. The only people remaining who aren't Alliance are the civilian passengers. Something has infiltrated them, taken them over, and is working through them, turning them into saboteurs. They're the ones creating the ghosts. They want to destabilize us, make us afraid, make us turn back."
"If you're correct,"
said Wright, playing for time,
"then all you have to do is come out and explain your theory. Let Iolani and whoever else is in there with you go. We can deal with them if they've really been taken over."
Someone gently touched his shoulder and he nearly jumped out of his skin. Colburn stood behind him, gun in one hand, a helmet in the other. He took it and put it on. The HUD lit up and he quietly stated his instructions. "That's the problem," said Larson. "How will you tell? That's what I've been struggling with. I was sure about the American, but what about the others? Which ones are compromised and which are normal? It would be safer to kill them all. I'm not sure I can trust you to do that. I admit I'm finding it hard myself." Wright had accessed the ship's security system. He had a choice of 3 views of the briefing room, derived from the cameras inside. He relayed the real-time vids to the Marines waiting opposite him.
"Don't do anything hasty," said Wright. "We have time to talk about this."
"Have we? I'm not too sure about that. I'm not a fool, Major. You're hatching something out there as we speak. In fact," he added, there was a whisper of pulse fire and the security images on Wright's HUD died. "Ha!" said Larson. "Wish I'd thought of that before. Better late than never, I suppose." "Group Captain Larson, this is Dr. Kim. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of making your acquaintance." Kim was standing behind Colburn. Both women were too close. He gestured for them to get back. "You brought in the shrink?" Larson exclaimed. "Too predictable for words. I'm disappointed." "Group Captain," Kim called from her more distant spot, "I know you don't want to hurt anyone. Please put your weapon down and come out, and we can talk." Wright had only seen a glimpse of the setup in the briefing room. It was enough, but he had to act fast before anyone changed position. After giving the Marines brief orders, he took off his helmet. It would be better to send in someone in armour first, but there would only be time for one good shot, and he wanted to be the one to take it. He held up his hand, 5 digits outspread. He closed in his thumb. 4, 3, 2. The security cameras had revealed a dismal scene. As well as one dead civilian lying next to the door, the back of his head destroyed, another corpse lay face down on a table. The man had been shot in the back. It looked as though Larson had shot him first and then fired on the second one as he'd tried to bolt from the room. That must have been when Iolani had managed to get word out about what was happening. 4 men and women crouched in a corner. Wright had recognized the other American who had attended the crossing the line meeting. He didn't know the others, and his short appraisal of the scene hadn't revealed if they were all civilians. Perhaps Larson had caught Iolani comming about the situation, for where he faced the door, he had her on her knees in front of him, her back toward him, his gun aimed at her head. There was no question of allowing Larson a chance to give himself up. The risk to Iolani was too great. 1. Wright stepped through the open doorway, aimed and fired, hitting the group captain in the chest at nearly point-blank range. He collapsed onto Hale. The other Marines sprang into the room and ran to the group in the corner, rifles raised, but it appeared Larson had been acting alone. The 4 were not armed and were plainly terrified. Wright strode to Iolani, who had curled into a ball on the deck, her arms covering her head. He kicked Larson's weapon away and lifted the man's body off her. She was smeared with his blood. Miraculously, Larson was still alive. He groaned faintly and then, blood bubbling in his throat, exhaled and was still. Iolani was rigid. When Wright touched her, she didn't move. "It's okay," he said. "It's over now." "He's dead?" she whispered. "Yes, he's dead." She peeked out. "It's okay," Wright repeated. He helped her uncurl. She sat up and he held her, patting her back to reassure her she was safe.
Good work, Major, said Colburn.
Chapter 11. Carol and Colburn sat together at the meeting to discuss the incident. Arthur was on Colburn's right. Dr. Kim had been invited to report on the psychological status of the crew and passengers, and Hale was here to give her opinion on the nature of the spectres that kept appearing. The American, Wright had only just learned his name, Josh Grady, hadn't been invited originally, but had insisted on attending. As soon as Wright heard the man's name, he recognised it. Mr. Grady was a business magnate who had built his fortune in the solar power industry, supplying energy to most of the states, Canada, Middle and South America. In an earlier time, Grady might have been as wealthy as Talon. Centuries ago, the states had been one country, the richest economy in the world, and its government the most politically powerful. But over time the wealthiest state sought independence, breaking away and weakening the parent. As being united became less and less beneficial to the remaining states, they also seceded. Within 200 years, what had once been a mighty nation had become 50 distinct countries, loosely connected by history. Had Josh Grady been able to lobby for the support of a United States government, had he been able to land contracts worth trillions in the early days of his business, he could have been building 3 colony ships and planning a life in the stars. As it was, he could only use his influence to secure a seat on the first ship to enter interstellar space and investigate life on another planet, and nearly lose his life when an Air Force officer went crazy. Kim was summarising her report. In short, I have serious concerns about the psychological well-being of a significant proportion of the crew and passengers. I cannot foresee these problems improving without intense counselling and medication, treatments which, as the only psychiatrist aboard with limited medical supplies, I cannot adequately provide. These problems will only be exacerbated as our voyage progresses. My recommendation is that the Dauntless turn back immediately, or we are likely to see similar incidents to the one in the briefing room, perhaps on a larger scale.
That decides it, said Grady. The doctor has spoken. It's time to turn the ship around.
Mr. Grady, said Carol, I know you aren't a military man, but I shouldn't have to remind you this is a BA endeavour. While we will take Dr. Kim's opinion into consideration, the decision to abandon the mission lies with the Alliance and the Alliance only. Thank you, Dr. Kim. He shifted in his seat to address the room.
Now hold on, Grady protested. I was nearly killed back there. One of my very good friends was shot in the back by a madman. You aren't seriously suggesting we carry on. I demand that we return to Earth. You can't keep me here against my will. That's kidnapping.
Colburn fixed him with her trademark icy glare. You are a guest aboard this ship. You have no say in her operation and no sway over Alliance strategy. If you have trouble understanding that, check the contract you signed.
I'll contact my lawyers, Grady threatened. I have direct, instant comm to my office, don't forget. You won't hear the last of this.
She's right, Ailani said wearily. As civilians, what we want doesn't count. We're entirely in the hands of the Alliance. If it wanted to fly the Dauntless into a star, there wouldn't be anything we could do about it, and our relatives would have no comeback. Thank you for putting it so succinctly, said Carol. Nevertheless, we are naturally taking the incident in the briefing room very seriously. Clearly the strange phenomena of the spectral appearances is creating an atmosphere of alarm and suspicion. Scapegoating is a typical reaction in these circumstances, said Kim. Larson was looking for someone to blame for his fear and a way to put an end to the perceived threat. If we do continue the mission, we can only expect to see similar events. By the way, I'd like to state for the record, I object to the way the situation with Larson was resolved. I should have been allowed the opportunity to talk to him. Wright said,
He'd killed 2 people already, and he was holding his gun against the head of another. No one regrets Larson's death more than I, but I wasn't going to risk him shooting someone else.
Absolutely, said Colburn. I stand behind Major Wright's actions 100%. Kim responded, There should have been a
There was no time.
Wright passed a hand over his eyes. Did she think he wanted to kill the man?
He had Iolani at gunpoint and 4 more unarmed civilians with him.
Dr. Kim, said Carol, Group Captain Larson knew the risks when he signed up. His death is regrettable, but I agree with Brigadier Colburn and Major Wright. In the circumstances, it was unavoidable. You've stated your opinion. It's time to move on.
If she's right, and we can expect to see more of this, Grady said, we should turn back.
Ignoring him, Carol asked Kim, Do you have any suggestions on what we can do to put minds at ease and reduce the possibility of a recurrence? The best option would be to prevent the figures from reappearing. That would help to reduce the current excessive mental strain. Do you think the 2 phenomena are connected? He asked. Could these things be infiltrating our brains? I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. I believe what we're seeing among the crew and passengers is a sane reaction to an insane environment. This is the first time human beings have entered interstellar space. Some psychological fallout is only to be expected. But every single person aboard has either been thoroughly assessed or has already logged years aboard starships. Living within a few days or weeks' travel of Earth is quite different from leaving the home planet far behind, Lieutenant General. She paused before going on. Identifying what the things visiting us are might help. Fear of the unknown is what's preying on many minds, in my opinion. Of course, that includes fear of the new territory of deep space, but there isn't much we can do about that. Ms. Hale, said Carol, turning to her, you're our resident expert on alien life. Do you have anything to say? I'm not an expert on xenoorganisms, she retorted. It's a new field. There are no experts. I'm sorry, I have no idea what those things are. All I can tell you is they aren't organic. They seem to be pure energy. You might be better off talking to the astrophysicists. Carol huffed in frustration. What about you, Arthur? You seem to be the one they visited the most, though we aren't sure about their history with Carla Orr. The king shook his head. I thought mine could be a creation of Morgan Le Fay's. She knew Guinevere, but if Morgan hadn't conjured her, I thought perhaps she was a demon come to punish me for my sins. I committed many due to Merlin's false counsel. When I learned Carla Orr was receiving visits from a phantasm too, my thoughts turned to Morgan again. But then Major Wright's father appeared, and now I am simply confused. Wright has a spectral visitor, Carol said. Why wasn't I informed? It happened the night of Larson's psychotic break, Wright said. Since then, yes, never mind, Carol snapped. So now we have 3 ghosts plaguing the ship. Damn it. Can Orr tell us anything? I don't think so, said Wright. I talked to her briefly after her suicide attempt. She seemed as ignorant as the rest of us. She might be able to help us more if she's allowed some human contact. She's in a bad way. My heart bleeds, Carol commented. The Major has a point, said Kim. From what I understand, Carla Orr was close to the alien, Morgan. If she were in a better psychological state, she might remember something important. Or if she's withholding information, she might feel more inclined to help us. She nearly sabotaged the FTL drive, exclaimed Carol. I don't know how, but she managed to persuade 2 highly intelligent engineers to allow her into the operations room. If we let her loose again, who knows what she'll do." "I wasn't suggesting we give her complete freedom of movement," Kim replied, "but some time spent with other people wouldn't hurt. Orr's background is disturbing and complex. It isn't fair to hold her entirely accountable for her actions." Wright was beginning to regret his suggestion. He had a horrible feeling about who would be keeping Orr company. Colburn was looking at him. "I think Orr needs professional help," he said. "From a professional." He turned his attention to Dr. Kim. "I am willing to visit Carla Orr," said Arthur. "We have both been tormented by the spectres." "She's terrified of you," Wright objected, though excluding Arthur meant the duty was more likely to fall to himself. "She thinks you're the only person who can kill her, and she might think you want to kill her." "Then I can reassure her I don't." "I'm not sure that'll help." "I still say we've gotta turn back," Grady argued. "And I don't give a shit about visiting a goddamn exoplanet. This trip is far too dangerous. I wasn't warned about ghosts or demented Air Force officers. If I'd known what might happen, I never would have signed up. If we don't turn back right now, I'll sue the Alliance for every penny it has." Carroll and Colburn shared a smile. "Mr. Grady," Carroll said condescendingly, "as I've explained, your opinion is irrelevant. If you wish to consult legal counsel upon our return, you are free to do so. But let me repeat, we are continuing with this mission. I have apprised the Prime Minister, Sea Lord, and the Chief of Defence of everything that's happened, and my orders are to proceed as planned. London has spoken on the matter, and therefore all discussion on the subject is closed. I hope I make myself clear." Chapter 12. Wright set a mug of coffee in front of Iolani and sat down. "Thanks."
"How are you doing?"
asked Abacha. They were in the mess between meal times, several days after the incident with Larson. Iolani didn't want to return to the briefing room, understandably. "Okay," she replied, in a tone that implied she wasn't. She sipped her coffee before adding, "You know, I miss greenery, plants, trees. The Alliance should have included a biome on this ship. It might have helped to keep people sane."
"Something to put in your report when we get back," said Wright.
"If we get back," said Iolani.
"You seriously think we won't?"
Abacha asked.
"You guys have to tell me what's going on. Us lowly corporals don't hear anything. What happened at the meeting about the shooting?"
"Ugh," she said. "The usual. Carroll throwing his weight around."
"Sounds familiar." "He is in charge of the mission," said Wright gently. "If anyone should throw his weight around, it's him."
"The short version is," said Iolani, "we're continuing as normal, despite everything that's happened and might happen. I'm only hanging around with you guys from now on. You two don't seem as crazy as everyone else."
"Thanks for the compliment," said Abacha. "I'm not, but I can't speak for the Major here." "I'm definitely not less crazy than the average Royal Marine," said Wright.
He was only partly joking. Ever since seeing the vision of his father, he'd been wondering about the state of his mind, yet Arthur had seen the vision too. "So, have you been sentenced to spending time with Carla Orr?" Iolani asked him. "I saw Colburn looking at you."
"You did? I got the impression she had me in her sights too. But no, thank the stars, I've been spared that. Kim is giving her counselling sessions. I don't think it'll help, to be honest. She's too far gone. The poor woman's round the bend. But maybe she'll feel less alone." "The poor woman?" Abacha echoed. "Are you feeling a smidgen of sympathy for her?" Wright shrugged. She must miss her son.
He went to take a drink, but an alarm blared out.
Shit! A batcher shouted over the noise. What is it this time?
Maybe Carla all escaped, yelled Iolani. They both looked to Wright for an explanation, but no orders or information had arrived via his implant.
The door's locked,
someone called out. The speaker was standing at a closed door, dragging on the surface with his hands.
So's this one,
exclaimed someone else. Wright calmed Colburn.
Stand by, Major,
was all she said. A cook wandered out from the kitchen and surveyed the mess, hands on hips. Someone approached her and Wright read her lips. She seemed to say, "Everything's dead." He went over to her.
"What's wrong?"
he asked. "Nothing's working. Printers, ovens, dispensers, all kaput."
"You've lost power?"
"No, the power's there, the lights are on, but nothing's working. I can't get into the fridges either. They'd better fix things quick or there'll be a mutiny. Nothing angrier than a hungry Marine." The alarm blasted out 3 more times and then fell silent. Still Colburn told him nothing. Quiet fell now the alarm had stopped. People continued to try to open the doors, though their efforts were pointless. When the starship door sealed, the only way through it was via molecular scalpel until the seal deactivated. Minutes crawled by, and no word from outside the mess arrived. Wright tried to exercise patience, putting off calming Colburn again. She was probably dealing with a crisis and would contact him when she was ready. Tension tightened as people grew concerned about being trapped.
"Hell, at least we have food and restrooms," someone quipped. "It could be worse."
No one laughed. Finally, 15 or so minutes later, the 2 mess doors opened.
"Major," said Colburn, "come to the bridge. I'll explain while you're on your way."
He said goodbye to Iolani and Abacha. As he jogged along the passageway, Colburn said,
"Something infiltrated the ship's systems. It was a massive breach, swept right through everything, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Everything. Databases, weapon systems, cloaking device, EV control, the lot. We're completely vulnerable to attack. The Lieutenant General is gathering all senior officers on the bridge to formulate a defense."
"A defense to what exactly?"
"Good question."
For the first time ever, Wright saw concern in Lieutenant General Carroll's features. The man's ability to remain calm and optimistic was legendary. If he was worried, there was definitely something to be worried about. He'd registered Wright when he arrived, but immediately returned his focus to the comm console. The comms officer also watched the screen expectantly while listening on his headset. Colburn approached.
"What's happening?"
Wright asked her.
"We're waiting to hear from London." "Carroll asked for advice before taking evasive action?" he asked incredulously. "What kind of evasive action would you suggest, Major? There's nothing out there. Scan data indicate the same vast vacuum speckled with tiny particles they always have. There's literally nothing to evade." "Except this thing that ran through the ship like a dose of salts. Something's there, we just can't detect it." "Yes, you're right. There has to be. The Lieutenant General has asked permission to turn back." "Ah, I see. Josh Grady will be pleased." "He'll be pleased if we receive it. I've a funny feeling."
"Sir," said the comms officer to Carroll,
"London wants to speak to you directly."
He handed over his headset. Carroll frowned as he listened. He nodded once, then twice, then his shoulders sagged.
"Yes, sir, I understand. I'll keep you up to date with any further developments."
He listened again.
"Thank you."
He took off the headset and returned it. Addressing the bridge, he said,
"There is to be no deviation to our route. We are to proceed as planned. London is sending new code to update our system security."
A ripple of dismay passed through the room. What good would new security code do when their attacker had swept through the old stuff like a scythe through grass? It's like going into battle unarmed with your pants around your ankles, someone remarked softly. Now then, said Carol, I won't hear any grumbles. We have our orders and we will follow them. That's it. Back to your duties, everyone. Captain, put the crew on amber alert and tell the passengers to return to their cabins and remain there until further notice. The captain, Thronson, opened the ship-wide comm and began to make the announcement. Chapter 13. A little over an hour later, when Wright had dared to hope the Dauntless wasn't about to come under attack, he noticed a smudge in the air. He was on the bridge, and the smudge seemed to be suspended midway between him and Carol. At first he thought he must have something in his eyes. He rubbed them and blinked, but the smudge remained. It was getting brighter. "Lieutenant General," he said. "Yes, Major." He pointed. The spot had increased in luminosity even as he spoke. Carol didn't need any further prompting to see it. "Good Lord," he muttered. Soon everyone on the bridge was staring at the brightening, slim oval of light. Wright's hand went to his beamer, but what was the point? How would a pulse round affect something made of energy? Whoa! He took a step back. The thing had suddenly shifted shape into a humanoid form, a figure resembling his father. "I've never seen one in the flesh, so to speak," said Carol. "Only recordings. This should be interesting." It spoke, and this time its words could be heard, though it didn't sound anything like Wright's father. The voice seemed to come from far away, as if spoken from the end of a long passageway. "T.J. Wright, is this form pleasing to you?" A pause, and the thing slowly flickered like sunlight through leaves. "Does this appearance cause you distress?" All gazes turned on him. "Yes, actually it does." Instantly the light flattened to resume its oval shape, edges indistinct. "We can only use images known to you. Your senses do not perceive us. We apologize for disturbing you. Your minds are difficult for us to comprehend." "I am Lieutenant General Carroll, and I am the one in charge here. Who are you? I demand on behalf of the Britannic Alliance that you reveal your identity." The thing didn't move in response to Carol's statement. It could probably see or perceive everything around it. "There is no word in any of your languages for what we are. Perhaps you would call us aliens." "Why not?" asked Colburn. "You're clearly an alien life of some kind." "Alien means not of your home planet." "Then you're from Earth?" Colburn asked. "We are not from anywhere. We are from everywhere." Carol stepped closer to the light and said, "Was it you who went through our ship's systems?" "We needed a better understanding of your species and methods of communication. Our previous attempts to communicate with you were unsuccessful. Now we have established contact, we will impart important information soon. We will return." The light was gone. "Fuck," someone breathed. Wright could have said the same himself. "Language, Marine," snapped Carol. He turned to Wright. "If it knows everything about us and the ship, it knows I'm the highest-ranking officer aboard and in charge of the mission. Why do you think it addressed you first?" "Not a clue, sir." Carol drummed his fingers on a console. "And before you, it appeared to Arthur and Orr. Odd. The person it briefly resembled, that was your father?" "Yes." "Any idea why it picked him?" "Absolutely none." Carol turned to the captain. "The ship will remain on amber alert." The thing didn't come back. Carol ordered that all the data from the moment of its appearance until it left was assessed, but all that could be found was the usual slightly higher electrical charge. The Lieutenant General sent all the details to London, and the command to continue the mission came. After 12 hours at Amber Alert, Carol downgraded the status to yellow. The passengers were allowed out of their cabins, and some semblance of normality returned. Wright's duty hours were over. He went to Arthur's cabin, exhausted by the events of the day. Though he hadn't done much, the reappearance of his father and all the associated memories evoked had wrung his nerves. Then there was also the steady threat of attack from something they couldn't perceive and had infiltrated their systems like water soaking into a sponge. The cabin was empty. Arthur was probably eating dinner with Iolani and Abacha. He stripped off and stepped into the shower. 2 minutes of hot water was all that was allowed for showers, so he made use of it, quickly lathering up. He was in the middle of shampooing his hair, his eyes closed, when a voice said, "Major Wright."
"Shit!"
It was the voice of the thing from the bridge. His eyes opened reflexively and were instantly filled with soap.
"Ah, what?" he demanded. "What do you want?"
What was it about showers that attracted the thing's attention? Rinsing his eyes with water, he blinked and squinted. The light hovered outside the stall. Thanking the stars it didn't look like his dad, he repeated,
"What do you want? You need to speak to Lieutenant General Carroll, not me. I'm not the one running the show around here."
"That person isn't important. The connections outside your star system run mainly to you and the 2 other humans we tried to contact."
"Connections? What connections?"
The hot water cut off. Half of his hair was full of shampoo.
"Look, can you wait until I get out of here?"
The light didn't answer. He grabbed a towel and dried himself, rubbing his hair with distaste. He wrapped the towel around his waist and stepped out. The light was closer than he'd thought, and he accidentally brushed against it. His skin tingled. He edged around the glow and backed up to the wash basin. "Can you listen now?" the light asked.
"I'm listening, but hold on a sec."
Feeling like he was in a vid drama written by someone on hallucinogens, he opened the door to the cabin, reached out to the nightstand and grabbed an interface. He turned on the recorder.
"Go ahead."
"Your language is very limited, but we will try to explain. Your species doesn't seem to see the connections. Your transportation isn't following the paths. It is severing and damaging the lines."
"Oh, you're right. I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm not sure even our physicists would either. But we have some aboard. You should talk to them. Maybe they'll understand what you mean better than me."
"We are preparing a detailed explanation and will insert it into your database. We will try to communicate to you more simply."
"Thanks, but I'm just a Marine. I'm not important. I don't need to know this stuff."
He wanted the thing to go away. Aside from the possibility of it turning into one of his parents, he didn't want to put Carol's nose out of joint by being the object of the newcomer's attention. "You are important," said the light. "You need to understand. Listen, all the things in the universe are connected. Every atom, molecule, compound, and substance is connected by pathways your species does not perceive yet. You are at an early stage of evolution. Most paths form naturally, others are forged by actions. There are paths leading to and from your star system that were forged by actions, even though you are the first humans to leave it. Another species has visited your system, has it not?"
"Yes, it has,"
Wright replied, guessing Merlin and Morgan were the other species.
"At least, that's what we think happened."
"The connections from outside the system run to you personally.
and more so to the humans called Arthur and Carla Orr.
I think I'm beginning to understand. So you can see these connections outside our ship?
See is not the correct word, but yes, we can see them everywhere.
And you've been trying to tell us to stop our ship from breaking them?
No, we would prefer you did not break them, but they will naturally repair, though you should know you are expending excessive amounts of energy unnecessarily.
Then why do you want to talk to me in particular?
We want to warn you. The other species who invaded your system is far in advance of yours. It possesses knowledge you do not. It is playing along the lines, while yours is blundering about like a toddler.
Does that make sense to you? Kind of. You wanted to talk to me or Arthur or Carla because you see lots of these action-based lines leading to us. We've only just become aware of what the aliens were doing. That's one reason we decided to leave our system and explore outside.
You are taking the first step of a long journey. We wish you luck. The light seemed about to depart.
Wait, said Wright. This other species that's playing with us. What can you tell me about them? How can we stop their interference? Are they breaking galactic laws?
There are no galactic laws. We only saw a new, young life form and felt inclined to help it. Some of us believe we were once like you, a very long time ago.
Can you tell me more about your kind? How come our scanners don't pick you up? Do you travel in starships?
So curious, so much to learn. It is refreshing to discover what is in your mind, but we cannot answer your questions in terms you would understand. We have fulfilled our desire to warn you and adjust the balance a little in your favor. We will input an information packet into your...
There has to be something you can tell me to help us fight the aliens threatening us.
We suggest you don't fight them. They are far more powerful than you.
But
the light went out. Chapter 14.
I only want the ability to move freely around the ship, Carla said. I don't think that's too much to ask. I've been locked in this horrible cell for months.
She bit her lip. Was she pushing too hard? The psychiatrist's reactions were difficult to read. Dr. Kim replied smoothly, "You know the reason for your incarceration. What you did posed a danger to the safety of everyone aboard."
But I didn't do anything. I only wanted to understand how the FTL drive works. Who better to explain it to me than the people who operate it? Is it my fault they invited me into the control room? I didn't touch a thing, and suddenly I found myself being hauled out of there like a common criminal.
Kim gave her a knowing look.
I didn't do anything,
Carla reiterated sullenly.
Since when has it been legal to lock someone up for months for simply being where they aren't supposed to be?
We're aboard a military ship operating under military regulations. I'm not sure what rules you set in place for the EAC, but in the Alliance the military aren't governed by the same laws as the general populace. If you wish to make a complaint to the authorities on our return...
If we ever return from this godforsaken trip...
She took a breath and let it out evenly. Staying calm was difficult. She hadn't wanted to come on this mission in the first place. She hadn't wanted to leave Perrin alone. Not only did she miss him badly, he was too young and easy to manipulate. Naturally, that was the whole point. While she was gone, the Alliance would be rolling back everything she'd done in her days in power, undoing all her good work, returning civilization to its reliance on technology and orthodox physics.
The worst thing about being here is not knowing what's happening, she said. No one tells me anything.
What would you like to know? John hasn't been back for weeks. Has something changed? John? The apparition that appeared to me took the form of an old friend.
Ah, yes. The visits prompted your suicide attempt. They must have been very disturbing for you. Would you like to tell me more about that?
No,
Carla seethed. She imagined strangling the doctor, seeing the veins swell in her neck, her eyes pop from her skull.
I don't have anything to say. It was hard for me, mostly because I'm locked in here day and night. If I could just be allowed out for a short time, an hour or two. If I stayed under armed guard, I couldn't hurt anyone, could I? What could I possibly do? And it would make me feel so much better.
Well, said Kim, looking down at her interface, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to request a short period of freedom for mental health reasons. Being deprived of human contact is psychologically damaging.
Thank you,
said Carla, trying to sound grateful, though the words scoured her throat.
If you could request it for me, I would appreciate it so much.
Kim looked up and smiled. Certainly. Chapter 15. The astrophysicists were deeply excited by the information and formulae files that had appeared in the Dauntless's database. That was what Wright heard second-hand anyhow, through Colburn. The scientists relayed the information to their colleagues on Earth and consulted with them for long hours about what it all meant. Colburn said they estimated human understanding of universal laws had leapt 1,000 years ahead. He'd sent the recording of his conversation with the light to Carol. After debriefing, he lay low, avoiding the Lieutenant General's wounded ego. The fact that the aliens had elected to reveal the secrets of the universe to an officer several ranks below him had to hurt, especially for someone who had as high an opinion of himself as Carol did. Wright often thought over what the light had told him, but he couldn't make much of it except that it chimed in somewhat with things Arthur had said. His father didn't put in any more appearances, and Guinevere seemed to have given up on haunting Arthur, so he returned to his old cabin. Life went on. The Dauntless had covered 4/5 of the distance to her destination. When the mood took him, Wright would check what was happening on Earth, especially in the BI. Generally, it was good news. The damage Orr had done was being fixed. Roads were rebuilt, public facilities reopened, the economy reignited. His homeland didn't seem to be suffering for the lack of an on-site monarch. Perrin Orr was rarely in the news, though he remained a figurehead for the die-hard Crusaders. War crimes trials had taken place. Carla Orr was lucky in that respect, for now she'd escaped legal retribution for all the terrible things she'd done, all the abuses of human rights and conventions governing military conflict. Her name was often mentioned in the trials as part of the defence of only following orders, but the courts couldn't try her personally in her absence. BI law didn't allow it. Parliament could have amended the statute, but it didn't, perhaps unwilling to risk inflaming Crusaders' anger and jeopardising the fragile harmony of the multicultural society. So Orr was safe for the moment. What might happen upon the Dauntless's return was another matter. To pass the time, Wright had asked Arthur to teach him how to fight with staves. The ease with which the king beat him again and again was somewhat demoralising, but he persevered. It was better to lose to Arthur at fighting than a batcher at Shang-Chi. Arthur didn't gloat. "Do you believe Merlin now?" the king asked one day as they were in the middle of a practice session. He drove his staff at Wright's midriff. Wright twisted to one side just in time, and the weapon pistoned in and out of empty space. Arthur wanted to talk and spar. He must find it boring. They had been going at it for 15 minutes, the longest match they'd ever had. Wright had thought he'd been making headway, but maybe not.
"About what?" he asked,
bringing his staff in an arcing sweep aimed below the king's left ear.
"His patterns," Arthur replied,
ducking and leaping back.
"You were sceptical, and Talon didn't believe me either."
He swiped at Wright's calves. Wright jumped. As he landed, he leaned in and jerked his staff upward toward Arthur's chin, but the king smoothly turned his head to the side and drove a shoulder into Wright's chest, unbalancing him. Wright stumbled backward and landed on his back. The king brought his staff down like an axe, as if to chop into Wright's skull, but at the last minute he slowed it almost to a stop and gently tapped Wright's sparring helmet. He held out a hand to help him up.
"You overcommitted," he said. "Sometimes you have to jump, but you should never lose a firm setting on 2 feet if you can help it. Not unless you're confident you're landing a match-ending blow." "I was pretty confident,"
Wright replied, panting. Arthur was correct, but he wasn't taking into account Wright's many hours of hand-to-hand combat training. He knew about overcommitting. Putting the knowledge into practice when working with a new weapon was another thing entirely. Arthur smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. As they walked to the equipment storage room, Wright said,
"I couldn't trust anything Merlin said. Why would I? He was as slippery as an eel." "Now that's a comparison I can understand. He was indeed a slippery character, and still is, no doubt. But since the light told me about the lines and how they run to you, me, and Orr, I can see now he wasn't lying, or at least he was partly telling the truth. His species must be able to perceive the connections. Talon knows about them too."
Wright took off his helmet and stowed it along with his staff on the shelves. Arthur did the same.
"I tried to convince her that Merlin was right about patterns governing people and events, and that if we paid attention to them we might find her children. She didn't believe me at first, but I think she may now." "She did find her kids in the end with your help."
Arthur sighed.
"I'm sure she is significant. That's why I wanted her to come along on the mission." "Significant how?" "The lines that link to us must also link to Talon." "I suppose so."
"TJ, Merlin and Morgan's game isn't over. It continues. We know this because Merlin said he would be back.
If all things are connected, as the Spectre said, we're still part of their game. Only now, by coming out here, we aren't passive anymore. We aren't pawns. We're players. Talon has been a part of everything since the beginning. I believe she's a player too. But she's months away. What if something happens and she isn't here? We'll be at a disadvantage."
"She's more than months away," Wright replied. Arthur really didn't understand about FTL travel.
"Maybe you're right, but it can't be helped. She isn't here, and there's nothing we can do about it."
They went into the showers. Chapter 16. For the first time in the Dauntless's long journey, the scanners had picked up something that wasn't space dust, a rogue planet, or a comet on an eons-long voyage from a distant sun. It was another ship. Data was still arriving when Wright stepped onto the bridge. "She's heading straight for us," said an officer, Blake, before also stating the vessel's speed. "That matches ours," Carol commented. "Stands to reason the ship has an FTL drive out here in the middle of nowhere. Can you extrapolate back from her trajectory?" he asked. "Do we know where she's from?" Wright had had the same thought. Was the starship from the system they were heading toward? Had the Dauntless been spotted and were beings from the exoplanet travelling out to meet the new arrival halfway? Had they decided the best form of defence was to attack? "Working on it, sir," Blake replied. The delay meant the new ship couldn't be from their destination. They were so close now, the computer would generate the information in microseconds. So if no carbon dioxide-breathing aliens were approaching to greet or annihilate them, who could it be? "Well?" Carol demanded. "Sorry, sir, still working on it." "Should I try to hail them?" the comms officer asked. Carol frowned. "I suppose it's worth a try. Give only our ship's name, however. Nothing more." The comms officer complied. "This is the HMSS Dauntless hailing the approaching vessel. Please state your designation and purpose." When no reply came, Carol told her to continue to broadcast the message across all frequencies. There was only silence from the other ship. "Maybe we should try the new instant comm," Wright suggested. Carol nodded. "Go ahead," he added to comms. But if the approaching ship had entangled comm receivers, her occupants either didn't understand the message or didn't want to answer it. "The chances their technology is similar to ours is remote," said Carol. "Trying to speak to them is a waste of breath. We can only see what they do when they get here. Do we have any idea where they're from yet?" Blake replied, "They must have taken an indirect route from their home system, sir. The computer's showing nothing on their trail for thousands of light years." "Okay, it doesn't make a difference, I suppose, though it would be nice to know where the buggers are from." "Sir," said Blake hesitantly, looking up with concern from his screen. "Spit it out, man," Carol urged. "Their ship's specs, they're remarkably similar to ours. Their dimensions and mass. She even looks like the Dauntless, sir. I can show you." Blake activated the holo display, lighting up the center of the bridge. "That's her?" asked Carol. All attention was on the image of the vessel that hung in mid-air. If anyone had asked Wright to put a name to the ship, he would have said it was the Dauntless. "You're sure that isn't a mistake?" Carol asked. Blake replied, "Absolutely not. That's the vessel approaching us." "But that isn't possible," said the comms officer, speaking for everyone. Seconds ticked past as shock permeated the room. Blake asked, "Could it be us heading back?" "No, that's ridiculous," said Carol. Wright wasn't so sure. The information the astrophysicists had received had blown apart their understanding of the universe. Perhaps it was possible that time didn't work as it was generally accepted to work. The Dauntless approaching from another time seemed as plausible an explanation for what was happening as any other. If it wasn't the Dauntless, how could another life form have built a mirror image of her? Why would aliens build an exact copy of a strange ship? "Whatever she is," said Carol, "we must be prepared for every eventuality, including an attack. If she is an identical copy of the Dauntless, at least we know exactly what she's capable of. Thronson, turn off the FTL drive and activate our cloaking device. Let's see what our anonymous visitor does. Comms, sound battle stations." "Aye, aye, sir." Carol told the captain to prepare for battle. "You know the score," he added. "I'll leave the details to you." The captain nodded. They were in capable hands, the best in the space fleet as far as Wright knew. He was glad Carol hadn't allowed his ego to get in the way of giving Thronson free rein. Wright fastened his safety harness. The pilot reported the ship had dropped out of light speed. "They've done the same," Blake blurted. "The other ship's now travelling the same speed as us." Wright hadn't felt a thing. The thrusters had maintained the same speed, only now the Dauntless wasn't contained within a skin of warped space. "Same trajectory?" Carol asked Blake. "Yes, sir. Still coming straight at us." "Activating cloak," said the pilot. "Alter course," said Thronson, giving a new heading. An odd hush settled over the bridge. though again there were no tangible effects on the ship's interior now she was cloaked. The people aboard got the sense they were hiding and should be quiet. Wright was reminded of the attack of the Gallant on Carla Orr's flagship and waiting with Talon, Arthur and Merlin while Marines died in the fight to board her. "Any updates, Blake?" Carol asked tersely. Staring at his screen, he answered, "No, sir." He gasped. "We've lost them. No readings at all." "They've cloaked too," said Carol. "I suppose we could have predicted it. Now it's the blind chasing the invisible." "Yes," Thronson agreed. "We can't see them, but they can't see us either. We should be able to avoid an engagement. With millions of square kilometers of space to search, they'll never find us." "Sir," said Wright. "Yes, Major." "Can I suggest we prepare for boarding?" "Why? Thronson is entirely correct. It would be impossible to locate us now." "I can't explain why, sir," said Wright. "Or not quickly, anyway. I have a feeling it would be wise to be ready just in case." "Major, if they can find us to board us, they can also fire on us." "Yes, sir. But there isn't a lot I can do about that. Also, it isn't their style. If it is who I think it is, they'll want to play with us first." "Well, it won't hurt. The crew are due a practice drill. Go ahead." He unfastened his harness and began issuing commands as he ran from the bridge. Then he calmed Arthur and told him to meet him at the aft airlock. 1,000 alarm bells were going off in his head. The situation was peculiar. A ship that was an exact copy of the Dauntless and clearly stalking them, copying their every move. It was like the time after Carla Orr's failed victory parade, when, by some fluke, Merlin, Morgan, Orr, Arthur, Talon and he had all ended up in the same room together. Colburn had been there too, and Hans Jonter, though he wasn't sure if they mattered. The game the aliens had been playing with human lives had reached some kind of denouement then, according to Merlin. Was this the next stage? He raced to the nearest armory. Chapter 17. "I think you're right, TJ, said Arthur, as they waited at the aft hatch. He wasn't in armour, and he was carrying his sword, not a pulse rifle. Wright felt uneasy about the king's lack of protection, but he'd insisted that was how he wanted to fight, if it came to a fight. Maybe whatever Merlin had done to make him impervious to pulse rounds still applied, but what would the king do if the ship depressurized? "Right about thinking we'll be boarded?" "Yes." Wright didn't answer. He hoped he was wrong. Having Arthur's agreement only made him more worried he wasn't. The Marines were in place. All the Dauntless's airlocks were covered. Carol had ordered the passengers to return to their cabins and lock themselves in. Whatever happened, they'd done their best to prepare. He had a batcher with him. The man's presence on the ship was a double-edged sword. He was an excellent Marine, but Wright always dreaded the prospect of having to explain to Talon that her best friend had fallen in combat under his command. He wanted to keep him by his side. They waited, lined up on each side of the hatch and, farther back, across the passageway. Wright stared at the closed lock door. If, as he suspected, the aliens who had been on Earth in the forms of Merlin and Morgan were about to attack, would they appear in human form or in their natural bodies? What would they look like? What weapons would they be carrying? Booted feet came running up behind him. He swivelled his head. "Reporting for duty, Major." He scanned his HUD. It was Commander Ryan Fletcher of the Navy, armoured up. It was a noble gesture, but the man had never trained with Royal Marines. "Thanks, Fletcher, but I'm not sitting in my cabin twiddling my thumbs while others fight to defend me." Wright nodded.
He got it. Get to the back and try not to trip anyone up. Yes, sir.
Major Ryde? Came a one-to-one comm. It was Major General Bobbin.
Yes, ma'am.
Just to let you know, I'm at the starboard airlock. Another hero. Though she was Army, she exceeded him in rank and wasn't about to show him the deference Fletcher had.
Copy.
He cut the comm. If non-marine military wanted to help repel boarders, it was up to them. He wasn't going to argue about it. They might need everyone they had. Arthur scanned the overhead up and down the passageway.
How will we know when they're coming? Could be a few things, Wright replied. But don't worry, we'll know.
The words were barely out of his mouth when the Dauntless shuddered.
Something like that, he added,
before switching to a general comm to his Marines.
Weapons at the ready.
Every rifle lifted. Carol commed him.
Unfortunately, you were correct, Major.
Something has fastened onto us. Whatever it is, it's cloaked. We can't get any data except hull readings. I'm loath to pull away without knowing for sure we won't rip off our hull in the process. For the moment, it's down to you.
Yes, sir.
When Merlin had arrived at the Valiant in his black cloud, he hadn't come aboard until they opened an airlock. Wright hoped that was because he couldn't, not because he was being polite. If the aliens toying with them could enter through garbage chutes and every other sealed gap in the hull, they were truly screwed. A faint metallic wrenching reached his ears. He turned up his helmet's audio. The sound was unmistakable. The aliens were forcing the airlock. An alarm blasted out and echoed down the passageway. Tension passed along the waiting lines of Marines. Wright peeked through the hatch window. There was no corresponding window on the outer hatch. He could only watch until the outer hatch split from its surround, moved inward and then to one side. For a brief moment, stars shone through the breach. Then they were darkened. A black cloud oozed in, filling the empty space. The cloud grew even darker, coalesced, and turned into a human form. Wright swallowed.
It's Merlin,
he told Arthur. He stepped back from the window, adding,
He doesn't seem to be armed.
Maybe he only wishes to speak to us.
I doubt it.
Arthur ran his gaze down his sword's edge.
I enjoyed cutting off his head. I would enjoy doing it again. Arthur, he's going to break through the inner hatch, and then this passageway will lose air and everyone not magnetized to the deck will be sucked out into space. You need to leave now.
Merlin won't allow that to happen. Not at first, anyway. I think he sees me as his favourite hound. Wright wished he had Arthur's confidence. On the other hand, Arthur had known Merlin a long time. The inner hatch began to move, sinking into the bulkhead as Merlin drew it into the airlock. Depressurization alarms resounded, louder than the hull breach ones. Figures on Wright's HUD dropped into the red zone. All around, the exits from the passageway would be sealing. He glanced at Arthur. His hair had been whipped forward and covered his face, but miraculously, the man was standing his ground against the departing rush of air. Merlin stepped into view. He was wearing the same long gown and tight-fitting cap he'd worn when Wright had first seen him, and the same supercilious smile.
Arthur, he nodded. Major Wright, it's a pleasure to see you again.
How could he see his face behind his darkened visor? How could his voice pass through the vacuum?
I can't say the same, Wright replied. Leave this ship or prepare to be ejected.
Merlin's smile grew wider. He had just broken into the ship as easily as a kid opening a Christmas present. If he wanted to kill everyone aboard, he didn't need to go to this trouble. He was toying with them.
He moved to one side. A second Merlin walked in from the airlock, identical in every way to the first. Wright took another step back. Up and down the passageway, Marines sent their comrades glances as if checking they were all seeing the same thing. The two Merlins stepped apart. A third figure appeared from the airlock. Morgan. Her twin joined her. "Yeah, nice magic trick," Wright growled. "Now get out." But the first Merlin moved closer to him. "I admire your weapon, Major. Is that what you call a pulse rifle? I wouldn't mind having one of my own." He reached behind his back and pulled a rifle from nowhere. Laughing maniacally, he aimed the muzzle directly at Wright's visor. Wright fired. The round hit Merlin square in the stomach, opening it like a ripe peach. But unlike when Arthur had decapitated him, no blood came out. He bent his head toward the gaping hole, through which his copy was visible behind him. Then he evaporated into smoke, instantly whipped away by the vacuum. Wright backed up some more. Another Merlin appeared from the airlock, already armed. Suddenly, they were all carrying rifles. They fired. Arthur ran forward. He sliced through a Morgan's neck, but his sword had no effect. The cut closed as if it had never existed. He swung the blade through a Merlin, chopping from his shoulder down to his navel, but the creature didn't react, and the wound sealed instantly. The aliens were not firing at Arthur. Wright guessed they knew their pulse rounds wouldn't affect him. It was one of the rules of their bizarre game. "Fire!" he ordered. "Weapons free!" The rounds destroyed every Merlin or Morgan they hit, but each was quickly replaced. His Marines didn't have the same protection as Arthur. The pulses fired by the invaders began to have a devastating effect. His men and women were suffering under the barrage from the ever-increasing aliens, and there was nowhere to fall back to. They couldn't exit the passageway while it was open to space without further depressurization. It was win here or die trying. Chapter 18. Carla Orr giggled. It had been so easy. The stupid psychiatrist had been as easy to manipulate as the FTL operators. Morgan had told her once it was people with flexible thinking who were the most malleable, and it was true. Dr. Kim was willing to entertain too many possibilities. Her sense of morality was complex. The question of allowing a little freedom to someone who had threatened the safety of the ship was not black and white to her. Carla leaned out from her hiding place, breathless after her run. She had taken off in the opposite direction the moment the doctor's back was turned. She giggled again at the memory. She was free. Of course, the ship being under attack helped. Everyone would have better things to do than look for her. The military men and women were focused on defence, and the passengers had retreated to their cabins. She had the run of the ship. Where should she go? The FTL operators were unlikely to allow her into the control room again. Even they could not be quite so dumb. It would be delightful to go to the bridge and shoot down Carol, Colburn, and every officer there, but she had no weapon and the armories would be busy with people. Maybe she should murder a few passengers. Ha! That would be fun to do while everyone's back was turned. Even if the Alliance won the battle, they would have some sad discoveries to ruin their victory celebrations. But, realistically, who would allow her into their cabin? As soon as she was seen, she would give away her location. She had to stay hidden as long as possible. The mess? She could contaminate the food with something poisonous. That was no good. She wanted immediate gratification.
Not to sit in her cell and hope no one noticed what she'd done. She wanted to witness her revenge. She wanted to see and feel the blood of her victim. Ah, I know just the place. Chapter 19. In the midst of the firefight, an expected comm arrived. "Starboard airlock breached, sir." Wright told his lieutenant what to expect. He didn't know what else to say to him. They were in a tight spot themselves. The Merlins and Morgans seemed endless. No matter how many they shot down, more appeared. He guessed the vapour they dissolved into when pulse rounds hit them recondensed elsewhere and reformed into a new attacker. Meanwhile, his Marines didn't have the same option. Several were down already, the dots representing them turning blue on his HUD. They would not be coming back. Arthur was in the midst of the aliens, swinging his sword like a machete, hacking into them desperately. Sweat soaked the man's shirt and coated his face. He wouldn't give up, though his efforts were pointless. "Sit rep, Major." It was Carol. "We're holding them off for now, sir. I don't know how much longer we'll last. They have infinite backup from the look of it." "I see. The situation is the same at the starboard airlock." "I know, sir. Any suggestions would be welcome." "The physicists are working on it. They're studying your feed, trying to figure out a weakness in these aliens we can exploit. I'll let you know as soon as they have anything." It was something. If anyone could understand a way to defeat the Merlins and Morgans, surely scientists could, especially now they were armed with new knowledge. Agony stabbed his side. He'd been hit. The moment's inattention to deal with Carol's comm had been his undoing. The Morgan who had fired on him fell, her head destroyed. The black mist rose from her body and dissipated. The passageway, scorched, scored, and smoking from pulse fire, wavered in his vision. He blinked and it swam back into focus. Pressure hypodermics in his armour pressed into his skin, and the pain of his wound faded, though he could still smell his burned flesh. The aliens occupied the central section of the passageway. He estimated 20 to 25 of them. The churn of them, falling, vaporizing, and reappearing, was confusing. The Marines had been pushed backward into each end. The men and women in the rear were literally thrust against the sealed exits, unable to fire for fear of hitting their comrades. If things continued as they were, the Merlins and Morgans would slowly but surely kill every last one of them. "TJ!" Arthur roared, whirling his sword. "We must do something, or your ship will be lost." "I know." But what? A Merlin ran out of the bunch, his face wild-eyed and wreathed in a cadaver-like grin. The tip of Arthur's sword sliced uselessly through his neck. Wright aimed, but before he fired, the Merlin got his own shot out. A Marine at Wright's side took the hit on his visor. At the close range, the visor was destroyed. "Get back!" Wright screamed. "To the rear, Marine!" He fought the urge to vomit, the image of Patel's ruined face stark in his mind. He fired. The round ripped a hole in the Merlin's chest. The creature fell backward, already dissolving before it hit the deck. A Morgan was behind him. Wright stepped forward and fired again, blowing her head off. "Advance!" he yelled. "Give them everything you've got!" It was their only hope. They had to force every last one of the aliens off the ship. They had to kill them faster than they could regenerate. They had to seal the airlock somehow, detach from the other ship, get away. It was hopeless, and he knew it. Better to go down fighting than to die from a shot in the back. He fired again, and again, and again. The Marines surged forward. The helmets of those at the other end of the passageway appeared through the Merlins and Morgans. They began to gain ground. A barrage of pulse fire flew from their rifles. At this rate, they would run out of energy soon. But what did it matter? What was the point of conserving it when they were fighting for their lives? A haze began to build up as smoke from the burning bulkheads and evaporating aliens' bodies increased faster than the vapours disappeared into space. A pulse exploded against him, and once more agony flooded his body. He staggered. The shot had hit his left shoulder. He continued firing, cradling his rifle in his right arm. He would get a second dose of painkillers, but that would be it. Painful seconds seemed to drag out until the drugs finally hit his bloodstream. A Marine fell at his feet. He stepped over the prone figure. How many Morgans and Merlins now? 10? 15? A Morgan danced toward him mockingly. "Major Wright, where's my darling Carla Orr? She's aboard this ship, isn't she? I can feel her." He shot her in the face. He took a third hit. His hip was on fire. He fell to his knees. "TJ." "Arthur, I can't." "It isn't Arthur, it's Iolani. I asked Lieutenant General Carroll to patch me through." "Uh-huh." His hip was a ball of pain. The analgesics didn't touch it. "I had an idea." A Merlin was bearing down on him. He weakly lifted his rifle. The alien moved in and out of focus. He fired. The Merlin crumpled and fell, but Wright fell too. The deck rose up to meet his face. "We're going to try foam." "Foam?" He waited for the kill shot. All that was needed was a single round, point-blank range to the back of his helmet. But instead, he heard a hiss from overhead. Foam exploded on the deck next to his face. Pressure and the ship's A-grav was forcing it downward despite the pull of the vacuum. "We're going to try foam." They'd activated the fire extinguishing system for the passageway. Would it work? Fighting the pain radiating through him, he turned and lifted his head. A Merlin was dissolving, but as it did so, foam sprayed through its cloud, destroying it. The black vapour didn't make it out the airlock. A faint dark grey stain formed where the Merlin had been. The other aliens saw what was happening and hesitated. The Marines were hesitating too, confused by the sudden appearance of the foam. "Fire on them," Wright commanded. "Fire on the fuckers!" It was the last thing he remembered. Chapter 20. A hand rested on his forehead. He opened his eyes. "Arthur?" The hand moved away. The king looked older than ever, and melancholy lay behind his eyes, though he was smiling. "I'm glad you're finally awake." The gentleness of his gesture, touching Wright's forehead, was typical of him. Somehow the king managed to do things like that without seeming unmanly. It set him apart from this time. Wright tried to move, but found he couldn't. He looked down. Dressing swathed the part of his torso visible above the bedsheet. He turned his head. He was in sick bay. "We won. The battle, not the war. Thank the stars." He closed his eyes. "I really thought we'd had it. It was close. If Iolani hadn't come up with her suggestion, I was all out of ideas. How to defeat something that doesn't or can't die. Fire extinguishing foam. Who would have thought it could be something so simple?" "I should have thought of it myself," said Arthur. "Rain washes dust from the air. Even I know that. All we needed was something to destroy the black clouds." "You know plenty of things no one else can even guess at these days. Things we forgot long ago." "Perhaps." "What's happened to their ship?" "Teams are working on it at the moment, figuring out if we can attach her to the Dauntless and take her home with us." "Huh?" "After the last Merlin and Morgan left, Lieutenant General Carroll took an educated guess at where the mirror ship sat and fired on her with the new weapon." "The EMP emitter?" "If that's what it's called. We knocked out their electronics,
Fantastic. The cloak over their ship failed, and we could board her. Let me guess, it was empty.
Arthur smiled.
You are correct. The Merlins and Morgans had deserted her. I'm not sure why. Maybe they were worried we'd be carrying super soakers. Super soakers? Is that a kind of gun? Anyway, I don't think so. It's probably something to do with their game.
His smile grew wider.
I think we won this round. I think we did.
They laughed, but it made Wright's shoulder hurt, so he quickly stopped.
Was their ship the same as ours on the inside too? He asked. I heard it looked the same. I expect others can answer you better than I.
Their conversation paused as Wright gathered courage.
Do you know how many we lost?
Arthur looked down.
19 altogether, 17 Marines, Commander Fletcher, and the passenger, Joss Grady. Grady? How did he die? Did he get caught in crossfire? He should have stayed in his cabin.
He was at the starboard airlock with Bobbin.
He was fighting? Damn, she shouldn't have let him.
Perhaps,
but it's hard to deny a valorous request.
Major? Colburn's hard-clipped tones cut through the friendly atmosphere. She came up behind Arthur, and when she reached him, she silently gave him a hard stare.
I'd better let you rest, said Arthur.
Even the King of the Britannic Isles quailed under the Brigadier's negative attention. Major Wright, she said after Arthur left, her tone softened almost to kindness. I'm glad you made it. How are you feeling? Not in too much pain, I hope?
I'm okay, ma'am.
Excellent. The doctor expects you'll be up and around in 48 hours. The healing gels are remarkable. She sat down and Wright's heart sank. She clearly planned on sticking around. Fatigue was catching up with him and he would rather have gone back to sleep. Major, your performance during this mission has been exemplary. You have demonstrated exceptional courage, initiative and leadership. I am recommending you for promotion.
Thank you, ma'am, but I was actually thinking of...
She held up a hand to silence him. Before you say anything, please listen. Physicists on Earth have been working on the information packet we sent them. As you know, considerably more time has passed there than we've experienced while travelling at light speed. Without any exaggeration, it seems the information has lifted humanity's understanding of the physical universe to an entirely new level. We know vastly more than we could have expected to discover for centuries. Apparently in reaction to his underwhelmed expression, she continued in a heavier tone, The Alliance has begun construction of a vessel containing a new drive that can exploit this new knowledge. The engineers refer to it as moving along the skeins, or some such phrase. It doesn't matter. The point is, after a reasonable period of recuperation, we would like you to...
Ma'am, I really feel I've done more than my duty in helping the Alliance's cause.
You have, she answered gravely. I'm not denying it. More than anyone could reasonably expect. However, it turns out what the light told you is true. You are already deeply involved in this conflict between us and the aliens who infiltrated our planet long ago. And so are many others. Taylan Ellis, for example.
Arthur was right.
Arthur was entirely right.
Damn.
This new knowledge we have doesn't take away our free will. You can always refuse, but, well, knowing the implication of your refusal is unavoidable. I have thought it over myself, and I feel I don't actually have much choice.
You're involved too?
She nodded and then stood up. I'll leave you in peace. Think it over. You have plenty of time. We have a long return journey ahead of us.
We aren't going to the planet anymore.
There's no longer any point. Not now we understand what's happening. He must have dozed off. All he knew was he couldn't breathe. A hand was clamped over his mouth and nose. Carla Orr was looking down at him, her eyes manic and inhuman, her mouth open and curved into a rictus. He struggled, but she was up on his bed, her knee on his chest. He couldn't throw her off. He was too weak and in too much pain.
"Oh yes, Major Wright," she hissed. "Not so brave, manhandling a woman. How does it feel now the tables are turned? Now I'm the one in power over you."
Her mad grin deepened and her eyes flashed.
"I might not rule my domain anymore. I might have been torn from my child, but I can still get my revenge. I can still see the blood of at least one of my enemies, and I will."
She lifted a scalpel in her other hand. Its blade glinted.
"Not very big, is it? I would prefer something longer and the time to slowly flay you alive. But it's long enough to reach the artery in your neck. Goodbye, Major Wright."
A tall figure swooped in. Large hands grasped Orr's arms and lifted her bodily off the bed. Wright gasped as he breathed again. Arthur had her. She fought him, kicking, biting and scratching, but she was no match for the powerful man. He fastened her in a bear hug, her back against his chest and her feet off the floor, ignoring the blows from her heels.
"Dear wife," he said into her ear, "I thought you might try something like this. I would gladly slit your throat for trying to kill my friend, but sadly you're still important in this game we must play. Come with me."
He winked at Wright and carried her away. Chapter 21. A flower seller had set up shop on a street, her wares stacked in bundles or crammed into buckets of water. Sweet fragrances filled the air. The seller sat on a low stool in the midst of the delicate petals and beautiful hues, wearing clothes that mimicked their shades. Her garb reminded Wright of the outfit Talon had worn when she'd masqueraded as a fortune-teller, when the BI had been under Carla Orr's tyrannical rule, and she'd spread her backwards misery over the land. How desperate and sad Talon had been, deep down, in those days. She'd covered it up with hostility and aloofness. As her commanding officer, he should have seen it. He should have seen something was wrong. "Flowers, sir?" the seller asked. He realised he'd been looking at them for several minutes. "Something for a loved one? Or," she added, winking, "someone you want to love you?"
"I'll take those," he replied, pointing to a bunch of pink and yellow blooms.
The seller wrapped the flowers in a sheet of paper from the stack at her feet and handed them over. Wright looked for her cred chip scanner. "Cash only, sir." He dug in his pocket. He'd been warned about this at the spaceport and had withdrawn a stash of paper notes from his account. During his onward journey, he'd noticed the Isles had become a strange place in his absence. It hadn't entirely reverted to the BI he'd grown up in, a modern nation with modern systems and conveniences. It was an amalgam of the old and the new. The Crusaders had been allowed to retain their practices and beliefs, with the exception that their children had to attend state schools and receive orthodox medical care. Though it was often subtle, the influence of the cultists could still be seen everywhere, such as here at this flower stall. He wasn't sure how he felt about the transformation of his homeland. He would have preferred the EAC to be entirely eradicated and the Isles returned to exactly as they had been in his childhood. But no one could change the past. The BI of history was gone forever, as were all the historical versions of the Isles before it, right back to Arthur's time and beyond. The invaders couldn't be forced to leave or change their behaviour without more conflict, bloodshed and deaths. He supposed this way was the lesser of two evils. He paid for the flowers and the seller tucked the money into her belt. "What are they?" he asked. "Roses and carnations." She paused before continuing. "She'll say yes, sir. I can feel it in my bones. The old ones are smiling on you." "Thank you. I hope so." A short while later, he was walking up the road where Talon lived. The houses rose in ranks up the hillside, nearly identical and fronting directly onto the street in the old style. He stepped to her door, took a deep breath and pressed the buzzer. Then, in a quick afterthought, he darted to the side of the house and placed the flowers on the ground around the corner. So much time had passed since he'd seen Talon, and he'd told her not to wait for him. If she'd moved on, as she probably had, he didn't want to embarrass her. He made it back to the door just as it opened. A young girl stood there, about 12 or 13, her eyebrows lifting in surprise at his sudden appearance. "Is Taylan Ellis here?" The girl looked at him uncertainly. Not answering him, she turned and called inside. "There's a strange man at the door, a soldier." Strange man? He'd come straight here after disembarking from the Dauntless, not wasting time on changing out of uniform. He didn't correct her mistake about his service. Another girl appeared in the doorway, or rather a young woman. She appeared to be about 20 or so. "I'd like to see Talon," he explained. "Is she home?" The woman looked him up and down before replying. "She's out in the back garden. You can go around the outside." She pointed to the path. As she closed the door, the sound of giggling escaped. He followed the path down the side of the house to the lawn at the end. The morning sun cast the path in shadow, but shone brilliantly on the grass. He stood in the shade. It was a long garden, and at the end 2 figures were sparring with staves. They were wearing protective helmets, but he recognized Talon instantly. He knew the way she fought, her expertise lending unmistakable economy, power, speed and grace to her movements. He remembered the time Colburn and he had watched her fight a batcher in the Valiant's gym, and the Brigadier had snatched a child's jewellery from her neck. Who was she sparring with this time? As he watched, his tenuous hope began to fade. Her partner was a man. He was good, though not as good as Talon. She had found a friend with shared interests. The question was, how close were they? He watched the match, uncertain. Should he stay and wait until they were finished, or should he leave now and avoid an encounter that could be awkward for all 3 of them? Maybe it would have been better to mail her to tell her he was back and then let her take the lead. He'd been impulsive and overly optimistic, which wasn't his style. He should have thought things through better. There was a thud and an "ow." Talon had broken through her opponent's defence and landed a blow on the side of his head. The man staggered and dropped his staff. The ends of their weapons were padded, but the hit had clearly hurt. Talon also dropped her staff and leapt over to her partner. "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! Does it hurt?" She held his head and peered into his eyes before hugging him. Wright smiled sadly as hope departed. The man was clearly more to her than just a sparring partner. She would never have cared about a batcher or any other Marine getting hurt in a practice fight. It came with the territory. He turned to leave. "Right!" When he looked back, she was racing down the long garden, ripping off her helmet and throwing it to the ground. She reached him in a few seconds and bounded up like a puppy, wrapping her arms around his neck and her legs around his hips, nearly bowling him over. He held on to her tightly in silence as seconds passed. She was sweaty and her hair was a mess, and he loved her. "You're back," she said. "I can't believe it. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? How long has it been?"
9 years and 5 months.
He could have told her how many weeks and days too, but it seemed excessive. She let go of him and dropped down. "Look at you!" She cupped his face in her hands. "You don't look any different. You haven't aged at all." She gasped and said softly, "Oh," before ducking her head. "But I have."
"It's okay. I had a few years on you. Now you have a few on me. It's fine."
She looked up. He kissed her forehead. She touched the spot self-consciously. "I have a wrinkle there, right? You just kissed my wrinkle." He bent to kiss her on the lips. There was a small cough. The man Talon had been sparring had walked over and was standing nearby with his helmet under his arm, looking mildly embarrassed. Noticing Wright looking at him, he held out his hand.
"I'm Patrin,"
Wright finished for him, shaking his hand.
"It took me a moment. At the risk of sounding cliched, you've grown."
"He has, hasn't he?" said Talon, touching her son's shoulder. "And he hasn't stopped yet. It wouldn't surprise me if he ended up as big as Arthur. How is Arthur, by the way?"
"Not too bad. Wait, I have something for you."
He went to retrieve the flowers. His clothes felt strange as he sat down to dinner with Talon's family that evening. She had persuaded him to print some civvies to wear so he would look like a normal person. The home printer was a bit of a luxury, she'd explained, bought courtesy of Lorcan Talman's funds, on which they'd all been living in modest comfort since leaving the Dauntless. They ate quietly. The excitement of the day seemed to have exhausted everyone, except Wright wasn't exhausted so much as overwhelmed. It wasn't only the happiness and relief of seeing Talon again and discovering she still felt the same toward him. It was something else. As he ate, he realized it was the fact he was with a family, a happy, loving family he could be a part of one day with luck. Even when he'd gone to live with his best friend after his parents kicked him out, he'd never had this. He'd always known the arrangement was temporary. Though his mouth was empty, he swallowed. He put down his knife and fork, unable to go on. Talon put her hand over his and smiled at him. He swallowed again, to try to make his voice sound normal.
"It's delicious, but I can't eat any more."
"I'm glad you like it. The potatoes and peas are from the garden."
"Really? That's great. You're a fantastic cook."
"Thanks, I try my best." A blob of mashed potato hit her in the face. The young woman, who Wright had learned was called Caris, had thrown it. A peal of laughter burst from Talon as she wiped off the potato. "I didn't cook it, Caris did. She's the fantastic cook. I'm only pretty good."
"I'm not sure I'd say that," said Patrin.
"Hey, you better be careful what you say," Talon retorted. "We're sparring again tomorrow, remember?" Wright hadn't figured out exactly who Caris was. He hadn't recognised Kayla when he'd seen her at the door, as she'd only been 3 or 4 at the meeting on the Dauntless. But now it was clear who she was. Caris was a little too old to be another of Talon's children, and she'd only ever mentioned having 2. As if reading his mind, Talon said, "Caris helped me out a lot in the early days after we came back to the BI. I don't know what I would have done without her." "You helped me too," Caris replied quietly. "You took me in." "Of course I did," said Talon. "What else would I do if it wasn't for you?" The pleasant atmosphere in the room dried up and expressions turned sombre. "Caris's mam and dad died in the war," said Kayla artlessly. "When she found out, she came to live with us." Patrin frowned at his sister.
Caris saved our lives when we were with the Crusaders, don't you remember?
Kayla shook her head. Who's ready for dessert? Caris asked brightly, standing up and beginning to gather the empty plates.
Let me, said Wright.
No, you're a guest, Caris protested. Sit down, Talon told her. Wright and I will do it together. Why do you call him that? Asked Kayla. Wright's a surname, isn't it? I never heard anyone called Wright as a first name.
Kayla, think before you speak, Patrin admonished. That's the second time you've put your foot in your mouth.
I was only asking. Come on, Talon said to Wright as her children began to bicker. We can get some peace and quiet in the kitchen.
Okay, he replied. I need to speak to you privately about something anyway.
She gave him a worried look. When they reached the kitchen carrying the stacked plates and dirty cutlery, she said, This better not be about me having anything more to do with the Royal Marines. I was kinda hoping you were going to resign. How long have you served? Do they count the time as it passed while you were aboard the ship or here on Earth? He put down his plates and took hers before depositing them on the work surface. Then he kissed her. Strains of the children's argument floated through from the dining room, interspersed with Caris's tired requests for them to shut up. When the kiss was over, Talon said, Nice change of subject. Now, what was it you wanted to talk to me about? A short while later, they returned to the dining room. The children's squabble was over, and Patrin was showing Kayla and Caris a bruise on his arm, rather proudly it seemed. Wright wants to talk to you about something, Talon announced. She'd listened to his explanation carefully, but, unusually, he'd found it hard to gauge her reaction. Perhaps she was waiting to hear what the others said before giving her answer. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Resting his elbows on the table and clasping his hands together, he began,
It's like this. Everything in the universe is connected.
The end. This has been The Dauntless, Star Legend Book 5, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next and final book in the Star Legend series is The Defiant. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.